check. Good morning, everyone. Hello. My name's Richard Feidler, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I want to acknowledge elders past and present. It's so wonderful to be with you here this morning, and I'd just like to declare at this point that Adelaide Writers' Week is the most fun writers' festival in the history of the world. Congratulations, Adelaide. I haven't had so much fun at a writers' festival in years. It's been brilliant. I am so pleased to tell you that I'm here with my old and dear friend, Wendy Harmer. I've known Wendy since we met here in Adelaide at the Lion Arts Centre on Morford Street when it was the Little Sisters Theatre as part of the Adelaide Fringe. People here remember that? They're going back far back?
In 1986.
1986. I'm so pleased to be talking with Wendy about her memoir, Lies My Mirror Told Me. Sadly, it's full of lies, as she says. Wendy was not brought up a poor country girl, I can tell you. Wendy had 5,000 people on a yacht for her 5th birthday. She gave every guest who came a car. Wendy has never suffered fools gladly, and when one of the waiters at that 5th birthday party dropped a plate of fairy bread on her party dress, she smashed open a bottle of Cristal and gutted the poor bastard there and then. No, that's not quite right. Wendy was a big star already when I first met her here at the Adelaide Fringe. My old comedy group, the Doug Anthony All-Stars, were on before her at the Little Sisters Theatre. Wendy was extremely generous to 3 spotty buskers from Canberra, which is what we were in those days. And when we moved to Melbourne, Wendy even offered a room in her group house to Paul McDermott, a man of imperfect personal hygiene, which was brave and kind of her. Afterwards, she had to have the room fumigated and all of her clothes burned in an incinerator, but she never once complained. Now she's written a brilliant memoir of her many lives as a comedian, a radio host, a children's author, and a playwright. Adelaide, please give a gigantic warm welcome to Wendy Harmer.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. And I want to share with you the review that I received from that very first year in 1986 as written in the Adelaide Advertiser. Ms. Harmer's woeful act consists mainly of tasteless racist jokes and the most tedious kind of dreary feminist subversion. This kind of ball-tearing, hateful penis envy comedy is sick unto death. It's just as well this obscene harpy lacks both microphone technique and comic timing, so that a lot of the garbage she inflicts on the audience is lost. She is a female Idi Amin. I've been to funnier car accidents. Thank you, Peter Gers. True. True story.
I remember that was when you were doing your cleaning lady character.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain perhaps the incident that gave rise perhaps to this vituperative review?
Yeah, well, what happened was, it was the most oddest thing. One morning after doing the show, I started getting calls from media all over Australia because accompanying this review in the Advertiser was the headline, "Comedian spat on me, broke my glasses," and Peter Gers had posed for a photo in the Tiser with like a pair of broken glasses like this going, you know.
It was on his head like this, wasn't it? It was all like
it
that.
was sort of like, you know, yeah, exactly. So anyway, so what had happened was on the night, and I was performing with Marianne Fay, and, you know, we were doing our Faking It show, and one of the characters that I performed, and all my characters are very, very bossy. Policewoman was the other character that I did, but Val, the cleaning lady, she was quite bossy, Val. she'd come out and say, oh, for goodness sake, look at the filth that's in this room. I've seen people give birth cleaner than this, whatever. And I did it on the Ray Martin show for years as well. Anyway, so this particular night, I walked past to this table. I saw this chap writing in his notebook, and I saw the word derivative written there. So I said, oh, derivative, really? You'd be a critic, would you? And he said, yeah, I'm a critic. I said, well, and I whipped off his glasses and I went like that and polished them with my cleaning cloth and popped them back on his head to say, so you get a better view kind of thing. So that's where this whole thing came from. So there was this headline, as I say, right round Australia, saying that mind you, look, I'd done this routine. I would love to demonstrate it to you, but the mics are in the way. I was on the Mike Walsh, the Ray Martin show, and Johnny Depp was on, and he had that Winona Forever tattoo, and I went up to him and said, oh, what have you got on your arm, you stupid boy? And I spat on my cleaning cloth and tried to scrub his arm. So, and whatever. Anyway, so, but I've got to tell you that I've kept all the cuttings, from over the many years, and I wanted to read you this, which appeared the next day. In the letter to the editor section. Sir, so your theatre critic, Mr. Gers, got his nose pushed out of joint, not to mention his glasses. I was in that audience and sitting directly behind Mr. Gers. I distinctly remember thinking to myself, once I realised he was a critic, how much he was enjoying the show. And I waited all week to read his critique, anticipating his favourable comments. How naive can we be? But the next paragraph delivered the delicious coup de grace. I work for an optometrist. At the end of the show, Mr. Gers' face and the glasses thereon certainly did not look like the caricature that the photograph of him, the advertiser, portrays. So far as I could see, obviously working for an optometrist, no structural damage was done to his glasses, only obviously to his ego. Or is it just that it made a better story that way? After all, he did make page 2 of the Saturday paper, didn't he? Penny Baker, Glenelg. Does anyone here know Penny Baker from Glenelg? Because I would like to send her a bunch of flowers even now because, of course, ticket sales just went through the roof. And, so there we go.
Well, Peter wrote a lovely review of the Doug Anthony All-Star, so I don't know what you're complaining about, Wendy.
There you go.
You've called your book The Lies My Mirror Told Me. Why that title, Wendy?
Well, what happened when I was born with a bilateral cleft lip and palate, and usually these days when children are born like me, as you will know, I'm sure they get fixed very early. They have plastic surgery at 6 months, 1 year old or something like that. But I didn't. I had to wait until I was 15 years old to have my face properly repaired. And I remember, and I was brought up in these little tiny country schools, where Dad was the teacher and all the kids were in the one, room and everything. And we moved to Bendigo in Victoria, and I started going to a much bigger school where there were 1,000 children in the school rather than there's 16 all in the one room in this country school I'd come from. And the boys were picking on me at school, and they were calling me eagle beak and flat face and pancake head and all that sort of thing, eagle beak. And so I came home from school and I said to my mother that the boys had been picking on me, and she said, I want you to go into the bedroom and you look in that mirror, and if you can find something to complain about, you come out and tell me. So I stood and I looked in the mirror, and I actually did have quite a lot to complain about. A lot. Because my face was very flat, much flatter than it is now, my profile, and my lip was sort of wonky, and I had no front teeth at all. And but I didn't never have the sort of courage, I suppose, to come out and say that to my mother. And so I came out and I said, I've got nothing to complain about. And she said, good. She said, one day you'll be as beautiful as everybody else. And so I don't know. I mean, I do love the quote from Jean Cocteau, who said, I think mirrors should, what did he say? I think mirrors should think harder before they reflect. I thought that was good. But so I think, I think for me, just that, and I've spent my whole life looking in mirrors one way or the other, and I thought there was an interesting motif. I really do think that perhaps the title resonates with women as well. I think that we can all remember a moment when we were a big moment in life where we saw that image of ourselves in the mirror, and that sort of stuck with us. I mean, now it's more like you're in a department store going, who's that old bag? Oh, that would be me. But so I've got the mirrors sort of before I went to the Academy Awards one night, and I'll tell you about that later, but the mirrors of backstage at the big gig with, and so I've just sort of recorded all the mirrors that I have looked into, the mirror backstage before I did my first ever stand-up gig. And so I've divided the book up into chapters kind of that way, yeah. There was a hand mirror, of course, that I looked into after I'd had my plastic surgery, which was a big one as well. Sorry.
You've said that in the past sometimes people have said to you, well, it's all right for you, Wendy, because you've got resilience. What do you think when people say something like that to you?
Well, it's a very odd thing to say, because babies are not born resilient, of course. It's not a genetic trait. It's something that you learn, and I was really surprised to learn, we were talking about this yesterday at the town hall, that the difference, there are some, of course, we're all different. There are some little, children that have a much harder time to attach than others. There's some that don't make those attachments, obviously. But we now understand that the difference between a child being resilient and not being resilient is just one adult. Just one relationship with a supportive adult can build that resilience in a child, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. And I was kind of lucky, my parents both went AWOL. For me, that person was my grandmother. And my brothers and sister, my two brothers and my sister as well. So, yeah, I mean, but also there is that support, there from that one individual. But it also comes through. I mean, I applied myself very rigorously to it as a kid, building this sort of carapace of toughness. Jane Eyre was my hero. And she was very stolid, and she had to do a lot of self-talk, I think we'd now call it, and I did a lot of that as well as a kid.
I don't think you have a carapace, though. I think you've got a bit of army, but you take it on and off. You're quite a loving person, Wendy.
Oh, well, that's...
That is, but I don't know. I think that's the lesson there, isn't it?
But I can turn.
Oh, I know.
I can turn like an ebony python, just like that.
You think I haven't seen that in all the time we've been friends, Wendy Harmer?
Yeah.
One of the most troubling things I remember in some children's stories I read, and it still troubles me when I read them in stories today, is when you have there's a group of children and there's no one looking after them. There's the parents have walked away, or the carers, the guardians have walked away, and the children are fending for themselves. That was your childhood for long, long stretches, Wendy, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. My my mother and father got married. They met when she was 14 and he was 20, and she got married at the age of 16. And
what was her preferred method of birth control?
Growing parsley. No, this is fair income. My mother was from Tasmania, and she grew up with her grandparents, because her mother absconded, and my mother absconded. It kind of runs in the family. It's about time I bogged off, actually.
Time for you to shoot through, Wendy.
Time for me to shoot through. But but so she was brought up with her grandparents and had absolutely no sex education whatsoever. But she did believe that if she planted parsley, it would work as a birth control. Can you believe that? Anyway, so yeah, she had me when she was 17, and
You're the first too, weren't you?
yeah, I was the first of four. My brother Noel was born with a cleft lip as well. No, it hasn't anywhere else in the family. We still don't know why that happens. It might be environmental factors. My father always believes it came from the spraying of pesticides when we were in the country, But yeah, so anyway, my mum had 4 children really quickly. By the age of 22, she'd had 4 children, 2 a miscarriage and an ectopic pregnancy. And on the last pregnancy, the doctor gave her a tubal ligation without asking. So at the age of 22, her childbearing days were over. And he said, "We think you've been through enough, Margaret, so we've tied your tubes." And she really dates that to the beginning of her, postnatal depression. So she tried to take her life when I was 10 with a drug overdose. And my father was then, he was like 32 with 4 kids, under 10, single. And he ran off the rails, really. So he would often, even though he was a school teacher, but he drank a lot with his mates on the weekends, and he would often go off to play football, and he would go on a Friday night, and he wouldn't come back till Sunday night, and the 4 of us would be in the house by ourselves. It was actually really fun sometimes, really. It was good because we could do anything we wanted, but...
Did that make you mum, though?
Yeah, that made me mum. And often there wasn't much food in the house, and they came and repossessed the furniture and, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it was a pretty rugged old upbringing.
From a distance, that looks... I feel a kind of tremor of fearfulness and dread. You must have felt that at times.
Yeah, I did very much.
There's no one around. I mean, what happens if one of your siblings got injured or...
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And you're like 11 years old?
Yeah, that's right. I did... there was a point when at a certain point when I was about 11 or 12, and the house was full with, I couldn't keep on top of things, and... Because my brother Philip, he said to me, "You were like our surrogate mum." He said you made sure we had things for lunch, and you washed our clothes and stuff like that. Which I hadn't kind of realised that anyone had noticed that. So Phil telling me that just recently was very affecting. That that he'd noticed that, but. I did. I'd seen my mother have a go at suicide, so I thought, oh, that doesn't look that hard. You can even do it in bed if you want. But so I tried to jump off the garage roof. But Andrew Denton always says it was a whisper for help because it wasn't very high, the garage. And I just sort of sprained my ankle, so that wasn't. He's very cruel to me, Andrew Denton. He's very cruel.
You wanted to be a journo from quite a young age.
Yeah.
Tell me about your first journal of record that you actually created yourself.
Oh, well, I did, yes. I wanted to be, one of the reasons that I wanted to be a journalist, and I did become a journalist, I was the first ever female in the Geelong Advertiser newsroom since that newspaper was established 130 years prior. So, I'm not a trailblazer. They're just we're very laggardly. Let's be
It must have
clear
been
on
like
that.
an echidna or something had started work there. It must have been so incredibly strange to those men.
Exactly. It was.
But that's not where your journalistic career
No,
started.
no. I'm jumping ahead. So anyway, the reason I wanted to be a journalist was because my father had decided that we have no impediment to my diction with this, no teeth and da-da-da. And in fact, on the first night I did the big gig, Richard, I rang my father and I said, "What did you think?" He said, "I thought your diction was quite good." He said. Anyway, so Dad wanted me to, have no speech impediment, so he would always have me sort of reading from the newspaper at the table, driving my brother, my siblings crazy. So I thought, well, I'm going to be a journalist when I grow up. So I was about 12 years old, 13 years old. We were living in the Dandenongs. Dad was teaching at Selby School at this time. And so I decided we needed an august journal to record the goings-on of this little rural, neighbourhood that I was in. So I named it the Greenwell Gazette because that was the name of the street that we lived in, Greenwell Road. And I hand wrote all the headlines and I hand wrote all the stories and I drew the photographs and I press ganged my brothers in to be my sports reporters and, marbles tournaments in the driveway, things like that. And then I put this thing together and I went into Dad's office in the school and I put it on the cassette and I rolled it off. It had 4 pages and a circulation of 5. I stapled it together. Anyway, it was a magnificent achievement. It had great headlines like, big screamers, "Power's on." That was about the next door neighbours who just built a house and got the electricity connected. So that was good. Anyway, so I'm flush with success. This thing's great, but I'm thinking what I could do with here is a bit of red meat for my readers, a bit of a scandal. Anyway, the Eagle lands when I'm on the school bus and the next door neighbour, one of his kids, told me that their father had driven his truck through their front fence and had been drunk and, and the police had arrived. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. So my red top screamer headline, "Ray was drunk." And I deliver it round the neighbourhood and in about 10 minutes there's, "Come outside." And there was Ray threatening to punch Dad in the face. So I got shut down. But
and was your dad like, "She did what?"
It was a heady couple of months in Australian media. I learnt a few things from that foray. I think the most important one was the power of the word allegedly. I think even if I'd written allegedly, Ray still would have punched Dad in the face. So anyway, there you go.
So you got work at the Geelong Advertiser as your first proper grown-up job as a journo. Although what you're doing, like Ray was drunk, that's legitimate journalism. No matter what anyone says, it's reporting stuff that people don't want you to know, which is the actual definition of just speaking truth to power. Ray and his truck, that's what it was. And from there you went to the Melbourne Sun News Pictorial, as it was in those days. I was fascinated to hear about your on-staff chaplain that the Melbourne Sun had in those days. There was a chaplain.
That was before Murdoch bought the Sun News Pictorial. The Sun News Pictorial, it's not that well known, but it had one of the biggest circulations of any newspaper in the world, rivaling Fleet Street. It was just the Bible for Victorians. Everyone brought it, especially because of the footy, But yes, well, it was owned by the Herald and Weekly Times then, and they were I don't know, they may have been Catholic, I think. But yeah, we had a chaplain who used to come around to all the desks in the newsroom, and everyone would try to appear sober when he came around because there were stories that people were sent away to farms to dry out like old dogs.
What was his nickname?
Oh, Creeping Jesus.
And what would you do? Would he sort of put a hand on your shoulders? "How are you going, Wendy?" Was it like that?
Fine. you know. Like these were the days where you'd have a big old typewriter and a big ashtray on the, you know, on the desk there next to you. I did a lot of rounds over the years that I did those rounds. I did industrial and transport and the city round and urban affairs, council, town hall. I've got to tell you, this is one of my favourite stories, is when I was at Geelong, I was the first ever female industrial, you know, rounds person, obviously. And this particular night, I'm down on the docks, and it's at the sort of Geelong Trades Hall, and there are, and the chairman, Ernie Roworth from the Seamen's Union's up the front, and the press table was also on a dais over there, and I took my place behind this sort of table, and you know, I was there with my notebook and everything, and we were about to get underway, and one of the delegates stood up and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say, are we able to get a front put on that table there, because the young lady's legs are distracting the room." Now, so I wasn't allowed to wear trousers, of course. That was not allowed. So I'm sitting there thinking, what have I been flashing? What have I been doing? Bit of a Sharon Stone.
Sharon Stone.
And then, God help me, they debated us, you know, like, oh, no, I don't think we should be distracted by the legs. And I'm like, oh, just dying, you know. And so there's another really funny thing that, you know, that I love to tell. It's that story too of one of the duties then of the when I was on the city round at Geelong Addy, I used to have to write the 3GL news, you know, the radio news, and I used to have to take it over to the. It's just hilarious to think, you know. No internet, no, you know, so everything's sort of manually, of course.
And there would have been a lot of snake news, as in like a man was bitten by a snake yesterday,
Lots.
wouldn't it? And,
yeah, very much so. Yes, Richard, there was a lot of snake news. Yeah, lots of snake news. Anyway, moving on. So I used to have to deliver the 3GL 6 o'clock news, and I remember this particular night, because I used to do my rounds on my push bike all around Geelong, you know, around the streets, and I'm wearing this fantastic pair of groovy sort of spiderweb pattern tights, and I'm zooming, you know, down Ryrie Street, you know, to go to the 3GL, and I get my tights hopelessly caught in the chain of my bike. And I couldn't go forwards and I couldn't go backwards. So 3GL had no snake news that night. I had no news at all. I copped shit for that for weeks, I must say. Yeah, but yeah, very fun.
Would have been fun hearing you drag the bicycle into the broadcasting room,
No,
wouldn't you?
I just want to say one thing more about the Geelong Advertiser. That is where I lost my name, Brown, because I got stupidly, it's a long story, but whatever. I stupidly got married when I was 19 to Michael Harmer, and when I was working at the paper, they made me take my married name, and I was always to be addressed as Mrs. Harmer, and so I never got the chance to change it back, and I've been stuck with it all these years, and I've been divorced from him from 46 years, and he had the temerity to ring me up just recently and say, "You didn't ask my permission to write this memoir."
But you've not been happy about any of the names on offer for you over the years, have you? Why didn't you like Wendy?
Oh, because it was just like Peter
Pan's
Peter
girlfriend.
Pan's fag hag. You know, you stay behind with Timmy and mind the picnic basket. You know, like she never got to go in. It's not even a proper name. No, but you know the story of the name Wendy, that it comes from Peter Pan, and it's a thing. It's so ironic this, that the little girl, she can't say friend, so she says, "I got a friendy Wendy, a friendy Wendy." Or it's a sort of a cute way of saying, you know, whatever. And so it's not even a proper name. The name
Comes
Wendy
from Peter Pan.
It comes, from Friendy Wendy. Oh, because, no, he knew, J.M. Barrie knew a little girl. Am I right? You're nodding here. A few people know this. He knew it was either his daughter or his daughter's friend. I can't remember. And she used to say, "She's my Wendy, Wendy," and that's why he used the name Wendy for Wendy Darling in J.M. Barrie,
right.
and that's why my mother named me Wendy.
So friendly, Wendy.
Yeah.
You're working as a hard-bitten, tobacco-stained journo, working on developing a nice bit of alcoholism on the side.
Yes.
How did you explode out of that and become the pyrotechnic, transcendent comedian that you did you became when I first met you?
Well, it's a very. What happened was, so I'm working on the town hall round, and the features editor said to me, "Could you, there's this thing," she said, "I've just been hearing about called the new wave of cabaret, alternative comedy."
Barry Humphries said that meant it was funny one night but not the next.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. And she said, anyway, apparently it's this big thing. She said, "Can you go and do a story about it?" Now, I had never seen any stand-up comedy. I'd never been to a cabaret thing. I was from the country. I think I'd only been to the theatre like twice in my entire life. So I get sent along with my notepad, and I went to, I think, Melbourne University, I think. And up on stage there was Steve Vizard, who was doing a character called Buddy Chuck with Paul Grabowski playing piano, like he was taking the, mickey out of these crooners. There was David Argue, who was playing I Go to Rio on skates with a foam piano. There was Los Trios Ringbarkers, Richard Stubbs doing stand-up, Gina Riley in a girls' singing group, and I just sat there watching this going, I was absolutely stunned. Like, the first time maybe you go to the circus and you're a little kid and you think, "Oh, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be a lion tamer or an acrobat." And anyway, I went back to the office and I wrote the story, and then I said to everyone, "I'm going to be a comedian." And they said, what? What do you got? And I said, "Yeah." And so I quit there and I went to the Melbourne Times, community newspaper, where I could work 3 days a week and work on being a comedian. Now, I heard later, Mark Trevorrow told me this, because Mark Trevorrow, Bob Down, he was a journo in the same newsroom as me, that they planned to have an intervention. They were all going to, because they could, she's going to go, but she's going to be a stand-up comedian. And even Richard, when I was on the big gig years later and I went back to visit my old buddies at the Sun News, they went, "Oh, come for your old job back, have you?" No.
I remember you did a lot of... your approach to stand-up comedy, I remember, was very distinctive. And for a while, you were a counterculture hero, Wendy. I remember that when you arrived on the scene. You were doing humour about the lived experiences of women, which wasn't being done much at all, if at all, at the time. I can remember the powerful effect it had playing to comedy audiences, which were, blokes and their girlfriends, and their wives. You'd see the women erupt into laughter, and I remember seeing them elbow their male partners and going, that's you, Daryl." And the blokes would be going, "Oh shit, that's a bit much. Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know about that stuff. That's a bit much, I think." But,
yeah, that's right. I mean, because that's actually what got me into doing stand-up, because I started out in a show with Marianne Fay and Peter Moon and Ian McFadgen, but there weren't any women, and there were lots of women doing sort of character work, but there weren't any doing stand-up just as themselves. And part of the reason that I wanted to do it was because no one was talking to the women, and the boys said to me, they really noticed the difference when I was on. One of them said, "It's a sound we haven't heard before when you're on. Instead of ho, 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 it's he, he, he." Isn't that cool? I was very flattered by that. Yeah. Very
It's a good
flattered.
way of making a point in Australia. I think you can scold people, men, for their bad behaviour, but if you can do it with make them laugh, men will go. I tend to find anyway. They go, I suppose that's a fair point. After a while.
Oh, I think she got me there.
I think she got me there. That's fair enough.
But for me, of course, this was great territory because no one was doing this, stuff about, it was, and especially it was around the time of Crocodile Dundee and Bogans, and it was very blokey, and of course I, came along, and so I had that territory pretty much all to myself, and I enjoyed it immensely.
I don't know, something about Australia. Comedy audiences in Australia, particularly at that time, were largely very blokey and heckled a lot, and the heckles were bad. It was always show us your tits, that sort of stuff.
I worked out a response to that.
What was that?
You can always tell the bottle-fed boys. Never mind, darling, you might get a girlfriend one day. She might show you hers. So that was fun.
Despite that, for some reason, Australia has produced... I think of all my all-time favourite Australian comedians, I think 90% of them would be women. So despite that...
It's very interesting.
Why... Do you have any theories on that or any thoughts on why that might be, why this country's produced so many outstanding female comedians?
Well, what happened was... and I wrote about this. I put together a book about women in comedy in Australia. It's a joke, Joyce, in about 89. And what happened was that we already had a pretty thriving sort of comedy scene, but it was all written by men. Like vaudeville, for instance, in that era, the stand-up comics used to say, when I say to the women in the sketches with them, they would say, when I say crocodile, it's when you come on. But they were never given the script. They were never allowed to read the script. They were never allowed to physically get their hands on the script. And a lot of those comics worked blue, and it's not sort of entirely known because you tend to think vaudeville was sort of pretty fluffy. But, people like Roy Reen, I was told, he had this one joke where he used to sit on... Well, now, hang on. That's right. He used to... There was a girl who used to sit... How's this for a setup? So elaborate. A soubrette, one of the little soubrettes, in a little shishi outfit. She would sit on top of a chicken coop and he would walk in with a fowl under one arm, and the line was to her, open your legs so I can get me cock in. That was one of the gags. And that's the way that a lot of that they work really blue. But getting to your theories, my theory is that what happened in Australia was a particular thing that the women got their hands on the script writing in the 80s. And that didn't happen as much anywhere else. If you think, and I think so. Up until the time of the 80s, in vaudeville, there were a couple of kinds of women that you could be. And it all revolved around the man. You were either the shishi soubrette, maybe in the French maid's outfit, and he would be chasing her, and behind him would be the harridan and the hair rollers with the rolling pin kind of thing. And so what happened was it's just this, with the burgeoning of comedy in inner city Melbourne, and we had Rod Quantock and Mary Keneally and Sue Ingleton. The women were just really strong, and they got their hands on the script writing. So that's why we had Big Girls Blouse, and why we had Fast Forward, all those really strong characters in Fast Forward, and the Comedy Company, Mary Ann, she goes. And I think that they had, that... Oh, what can I say about that? I don't know why they were more beloved than the boys, but I just think that they perhaps expressed a broader range of characters maybe than the boys in some ways. Do you think?
Yeah, I also think I think actually men like having fun poked at them quite a lot. I think there's some truth in that as well. And their critiques of men were often so blisteringly funny. And critiques of themselves as well, of course. Just the freshness of it was always good and surprising. And also the willingness of Australian women comedians to swear really well.
Yep.
To drop like the most evil, filthy line in the midst of being nice as pie, which would sort of go off and it's like a grenade inside your head. That was always wonderful
Well,
too.
you know, Magda would always say it was because they didn't worry about the way they looked. She called it uglying up.
Yeah.
So you look at those characters like, you know, pet, I said love, I said pet, I said love, you know. So grotesque. A lot of the women in England and the US would not, they always wanted to be a bit glam, but the Australian girls just looked like complete trollops.
Like,
And, you know, and loved it. And so that was what made them very beloved as well, I think.
and an ear for Australian language too. My favourite moment in Kath and Kim is when the two of them are walking along the street. It's before Kim's about to get married and she says, "What do you think about furniture? I'm thinking about getting monogamy, all the furniture done in monogamy." And Kath says, "No, you know, it's too expensive and too heavy. What you want is a veneer of monogamy," she said. That's one of the cleverest lines I've ever heard in TV comedy.
Yeah, fantastic.
So we were both in the big gig together. We were there from the very first episode. I have my own understanding of how the big gig got started, but you were closer to the centre. Well, you were right at the centre of how it got started.
Well, you were there as well. What happened was that Ben Elton was doing a big show in the UK, Friday Night Live. You know, it was massive, and they had an Australian special. And I was on it, Barry Humphries was on it, and you were on it. We were the three Australian acts that were on it. And so the show was absolutely extraordinary. You know, it had the big puppets and it had the, you know, the live audience, the whole bit. So I brought the tape back with me and said to Ted Robinson, we should do a show like that here. Now, what made it very different from the show in the UK when it finally got to air, because I don't have to tell you the story, I hope, about how long it took because they wouldn't have a female host. That went on for 18 months.
All the commercial networks knocked Ted Robinson back, didn't they?
Yeah, and then at the ABC, finally, he went back to the ABC and he lied. And he said, I've got a lot of interest around the commercial networks, he said. And they said, the ABC guys said, well, you know, but we're still not, still don't want a female compere. And he went, well, you know, I suppose I'll just have to. And he tells a story about walking out of the room and getting closer and closer and closer to the doorknob. And then his hand's actually on the doorknob. And he's thinking, gee. And then they went, oh, right, you can have her then. You know, so that's how it happened. But one of the things that Ted did that made the show so different was when you remember that when we did Ben Elton Live, the stage was like here. It was like here. The stage was here. The audience were back there, way back. What Ted did was put the audience right up the front and then put all the camera hardware in the middle. And so that's what gave it that in the round feel, and like that you were really at a big gig, you know, like you were at a night out. That made the difference.
You were already famous, but I can remember just before we went to air, live to air with the first show, we were still very much unknown as a group. And so I rehearsed the audience to give us a standing ovation.
Oh, yeah,
when we went on stage.
What cheats you were.
And so when he said, hit the Doug Anthony All-Stars, and the audience got to their feet to give us a standing ovation. And if you were watching it, you went, those guys, it must be famous. I just haven't heard of them yet.
It was so great.
I remember walking around my suburb the next day in Melbourne after the first show had gone to air, and everything had changed. For me, anyway, I don't know, and for everyone else that's on the show. Do you remember that, suddenly becoming kind of famous all of a sudden?
There's, I remember once I was stopped in St Kilda near my home by two policemen in peak hour traffic, and I'm so mortified, and everyone is looking at me, and I'm thinking, I haven't done anything wrong. And they walk up and they thrust a thing into the thing, you know, a pen and an autograph, and said, can I have your autograph? And I'm like, oh, honestly. But I've told you this story before. There was this fantastic story. I was at Paran Market, you know. I mean, so a lot of people used to come up to me all the time, and I always had this response, I'm never lonely, you know. But I'm Mrs. Have a Chat anyway, so I'm fine with all that. And, yeah, my daughter just takes, you know, come, Mum, can you stop talking? But I'm just, you know. Anyway, so I'm at the Paran Market. I know you love this story. I'm at the Paran Market, and there's a little old lady walking around with a, you know, trolley full of stuff, and she keeps giving me the bit of the side eye through the bananas, and then she's sort of peering at me over the tomatoes, and she's just following me around. And eventually I turned around and said, "Excuse me, can I help you?" She said, "I think you're vulgar." And then she just beetled off.
Australians are bastards. That happens nowhere else in the world. In England, they don't ever do that to
Very
you.
funny.
They'll make a point. During COVID lockdown, I was walking for exercise, and I had a COVID mask and sunglasses on in my local suburb. I walked past some poor old dear who was fossicking through the bins, and she scowled at me. She scowled at me, and I went, "Oh God, what did I do to deserve that?" And as I charged past her, I heard this voice go, "Doug Anthony All Stars, boo." And I was thinking, how's your life worked out for you, love?
Oh, so funny.
Australians will do that. They'll make a point of walking up to you and telling you how much they hate what you do. That's right.
I heard, I think it was Patrick, now I don't know whether it was Patrick Cook or David Marr who coined this, but I love that, and I wonder what the Adelaide equivalent is. But they say the difference between Sydney and Melbourne is that in Sydney, none of your friends will come and see you, but they'll all tell you you were absolutely brilliant, darling. And in Melbourne, all your friends will come and see you and tell you you were shithouse. So what's Adelaide? Everyone comes and sees you and says you're lovely. So there
that's
you
nice.
go.
There we are.
There you go.
She'll say something different once we're off stage
Yeah, I
about
will.
you, though.
Funny Adelaide.
I'll warn you that.
Only place these Grand Prix slows down outside antique shops. Did you know that?
So you went to commercial radio. You went to 2Day FM in Sydney, which was the #1 FM show, breakfast show for a million years. You were very, very successful. You made a ton of money out of that. Bought up pretty much all of the northern beaches, and you've become some kind of tyrant property landlord now up there. I know you've had a marvellous time. There's some bitterness in my voice because I'm still at the ABC, as you may have noticed. And that took you to the Oscars in 1997.
Yes. So this is a fun story. So. 1997, I just had my son Marley, and I'd had a emergency caesarean. Basically, he just refused at some point to come out, so we had to go and get him, kind of thing. Anyway, so and I was still breastfeeding him and a bit hormonal, and they said, "Oh, do you want to go to the Oscars?" We'd actually been the year before, but we broadcast from in the San Fernando Valley. This is me, Peter Moon and Paul Holmes doing the breakfast show on Today FM. The morning crew, we were called. And anyway, so this time, though, this year after, we were actually going to the real live Oscars at the Shrine Auditorium. So and we were going to stay in the Beverly Hilton, and I said, for sure, I'm there. Now, I should not have been going to the... I was not even well enough to be on a train to Dubbo, quite frankly, but I said yes anyway. So we had a fantastic time kind of doing the show from the Beverly Hilton. And Merv Griffin was alive then, and he used to drop by all the time, and so we got big friends with Merv Griffin. I remember Diane... This was when Ally McBeal was on, and Diane Cannon, she came one morning. She baked some muffins for us, and the gals are going to... I have to tell this story for the gals. So she puts on a seat next to me the most stunning yellow ostrich leather handbag that you have ever seen in your life. And I'm like just looking at this thing, coveting it, you know. And I said, "Oh, that's such a beautiful handbag." And she said, "Yeah, Carrie gave it to me." Cary Grant. Now, I reached out and touched a handbag that had been touched by Cary Grant, ladies, and I almost nicked it and ran away with it. Anyway, whatever. So we, after we'd finished the program that was beamed back into Sydney, we only had an hour to get ready for the Oscars. Now, what had happened, I was already in a tiz about this, because what had happened the night before is I pulled out my frock, and I'm not making this up. I pulled out my frock. It was grey georgette, and it had tiny little moth holes all over it. Seriously, it had little pinhole moth, and I went, well, I can't buy another frock. I'm just going to have to put a bit of a shawl thing on it. I mean, he's going to have to do. Anyway, so that was already bad enough, and I was sick, sooky and weepy about that. Anyway, I'm getting ready, and I'm looking in the mirror getting ready, and I'm thinking in my maternity bra, and I'm thinking to myself, I bet you Kate Winslet's not standing, because this is the year of the Titanic. She's not standing here in a maternity bra right now and crying and looking in the mirror and going to the Oscars. And then I went, oh, actually, my fringe is a bit long. I might just give it a cut. Using a pair of baby's nail scissors. A little bit too short. Ba-doing. It's sticking out like a fringe. So anyway, so I'm like, really, things aren't going well. But anyway, had to get into the limo. We had to go to the Oscars. Now, the funny thing is that when one goes to the Oscars, so you get out of the limo, and it's like, Richard, it's like being in the most sort of the pinpoint of light of the universe, you know, because there's helicopters and there's bleachers, there's people screaming, and there's lights everywhere, and there's carpet, and they've got these two aisles. You get out, red carpet. One's for the stars. Over there's for the Neville Nobodies, right? You know, this is for all the publicists and everything who keep the whole place turning. So I start walking up the Neville Nobody carpet aisle, and I hear this voice go, Wendy Harmer, Wendy, over here. And I turn around, and on the red carpet is Kerry Ann Kennelly with a microphone, because she is doing she's getting stuff for her midday show, and she's doing the red carpet for Channel 9. So I duck under the rope, and I go over there and I babble something about blah, blah, blah. And I said, you know, oh, really looking forward to being... And she said, well, what are you looking forward to? I said, oh, I'm looking forward to seeing all the stars, but I think, you know, the real action is going to be in the ladies' powder room later on. I think that's where the real action is going to be, in the ladies' powder room. And didn't think anything of it. Lights go off, I go on my merry way. Later on, I find out that my nieces and nephews, they're watching and they're going, oh, there's Leonardo DiCaprio, and there's Kate, and there's Auntie Wendy. And all my friends said, we cannot believe you made a joke about cocaine on national... And I wasn't even thinking about that. I was thinking about getting their undies off, you know, under their frocks. They went, I said, no, it wasn't about that. They said, oh, yeah, right, Harmon, that'd be right. Anyway, so I'm sitting there watching the show, and
Sorry, I was just thinking this is like another Ray was drunk headline you were giving, wasn't it? Really?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I'm sitting there watching the show, you know, up in the nosebleed section, and I started to feel thirsty. Now, breastfeeding mothers... that thirst is like the thirst. It's like on the planet Arrakis in June. You know, it's like the thirst, the mother of all thirsts. So I duck out of there, and I think I'll go and find a glass of water. And who do I run into but Shirley Jones? Now, Shirley Jones, as you know, the big musical star, won Oscars herself, but I knew her best as Shirley Partridge. And I thought, if Shirley Partridge, widowed mother of 5, can't find me a drink of water, well, no one can. Anyway, so I'm standing there talking to Shirley Jones, and she said, how you come to be here, and, Lolly, and I said, I've just had a baby. She, oh, you just had a baby? Oh, how marvellous, and how old is your baby? And at that point...
Oh, no.
I can almost hear, which is the sound of 2 patches of Georgette. Just because I've forgotten to put any nursing pads in my maternity bra. So there I am from the rest of the evening. I've got my program over one nipple, and I've got my handbag over the other nipple, and I'm trying to, get a drink. Like. And I had to leave early.
And all you're doing is pushing the stain to spread wider and wider, aren't you?
Hideous. Just had to leave. It was funny, actually, because, I've never told you this, but Brendan watched the Oscars that night from the deck of the Starship Enterprise.
Were you on drugs or something?
No. He took the baby.
Right.
And Marley was, as I say, 3 months old. And they went to a Hollywood museum, and there was the original sort of, set of the Starship Enterprise. And so he sat in Captain Kirk's chair and watched the show go to air. He had the better deal, I think, in the end.
You and I were at each other's weddings. We're still married to the same people. We're very fortunate, I think, in our choice of life partners. And Brendan is the most absolutely lovely man. You've got two kids.
And Kim is,
Thank you.
Same,
Yes.
divine lady.
She is. I don't know about you, but one time my daughter Emma came home from school and she said, "Ugh, Dad, when are you going to give up your stupid radio show?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Oh, my teacher came up to me and said, 'Emma Fidley, your father's radio program is exemplary broadcasting.'" And I'm like, What do your kids make of their famous mum, Wendy?
Well, Maeve was so ticked off that I couldn't get her Taylor Swift tickets. But you know what happened? I had the last laugh because I put it out on Twitter that we couldn't get Taylor Swift tickets, and guess who rang me up? Jane Barnes, wife of Jimmy, and I got 2 tickets in the Michael Gudinski suite at Accord Stadium, actually. So I actually did come through in the end.
So given that our daughters are pretty much disgruntled clients of services we failed to provide, she must have been happy with that, though, at least.
Yeah, she was happy enough with that till the next time when she demands something else I can't possibly, but I'll probably try to... No, they are very... it was so funny, when Marley, my son Marley, he said, at the book launch, I had a little launch of the book, and Marley was going around saying, Mum's going to sell 1 million copies of that book. He said she's, it's going to be 1 million copies she's going to sell. And, we're on the up and up, here. We're on a sure bet with this one. Anyway,
So that's now the onus is on you to make that come true. Today.
Yeah.
And Wendy will be signing books in the tent after this. But for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, please thank the magnificent Wendy Harmon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You've been lovely. Thanks for the lovely welcome and thanks for coming. Don't you have homes to go to, you people? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you, Richard. Thanks, lovely Richard.
Thank you.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Just a bit of housekeeping. We remind you, please do not move the chairs from where they have been positioned.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another incredibly beautiful day here at Adelaide Writers' Week. And I acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to the traditional owners of this land, the original storytellers. I'm Sarah Konoski from Conversations on ABC Radio and Podcast, and it's really wonderful to be in front of actual real-life humans rather than just inside a darkened studio. So thank you for being here. We're really happy to have you. This event is being recorded for Conversations, so you must clap much louder than that. Could we possibly try again, please?
Thank you.
That's much better, thank you. And I know your mobile phones are turned off, and if they're not and they ring, you'll be set upon by the people sitting next to you. So just be prepared for that includes you, Jonathan, most importantly. That's really not going to be a good look if your phone goes off mid-conversation. I am so delighted to be able to introduce you to Jonathan Rosen and his really remarkable book. In The Best Minds, Jonathan tells the story of his childhood friend, Michael Lauder. The two met as 10-year-olds. They were neighbourhood kids who played basketball together, walked to school together, went to the same parties as teenagers, and then both headed off to Yale University. But in their 20s, Michael's path diverged sharply from Jonathan's. He ended up in a locked psychiatric ward and the future seemed bleak. But after a surprising academic turn, there was a profile in the New York Times, followed by a big book deal and the commissioning of a Hollywood movie with Leonardo DiCaprio tapped to play Michael. However, what looked to be a great arc of redemption ended somewhere very different. Jonathan was on the sidelines, watching it all unfold. And in The Best Minds, he recounts what happened with great sympathy and a steady gaze. Please make him very welcome. Let's start at the beginning, Jonathan. When did you first set eyes on Michael?
Well, 1973, my family moved to a suburb of New York City called New Rochelle. And we lived on a very short street, 1 block long, and Michael lived at the bottom of it, and I lived at the top of it. And the day after, I think, if not the very day we moved in, he wandered up the street to greet me because I was standing in the street contemplating the house and the trash left by the former owners.
And what did he look like?
He was very tall. I was quite tall, too. He was really only an inch or two taller than me, but his nickname was Big because he looked tall. And he walked with a kind of lilting step so that in addition to being called Big, he was called Toes. And he was a much better basketball player than I was. But he also looked, there was something almost elderly about him at the same time. He had tinted glasses, which people didn't usually have. Aviators, which we all wore. But there was something almost geriatric, as if he was living backwards. And he was a very precocious kid. And he somehow looked precocious in addition to being precocious.
And why had your parents moved to New Rochelle? What drew them to that town?
Well, we'd been living in Boston because my father was teaching there, didn't get tenure, moved back to the orbit of New York City, where both my parents had lived for many years. For my mother, New York City was the epicenter of the universe. New Rochelle was a compromise, but she had a very good friend, Cynthia Ozick, who was a wonderful writer. And we moved there partly because she wanted to live in a neighborhood where her friend, the writer, lived. My mother was also a writer. And I think that they just thought this is the right place to raise kids. And in fact, as Cynthia later wrote me, they assumed I would meet someone like Michael, as I did.
You actually lived or grew up in a Norman Rockwell painting in the sense that he lived in New Rochelle. Exactly.
I knew nothing about Norman Rockwell except that in the movie Annie Hall by Woody Allen says, as a kind of put down to Diane Keaton when he meets her, or not Diane Keaton, it's someone else in that movie, you grew up in a Norman Rockwell painting. And that was what people who didn't live in New York or its suburbs experienced. But actually, Rockwell lived in New Rochelle for many years, launched his career there, painted local boys. So this all-American concept of, which was a sort of facade, was in fact, drawn from the very people in our neighborhood. And I was one of the signs that said welcome to New Rochelle was painted by Norman Rockwell. And so that sense of creating an all-American facade and what is actually behind it was something I came to think a lot about when I was writing the book.
So you and Michael's families lived on the same street. How similar were things inside your houses?
Well, in certain ways, we seemed like we were living perfectly parallel lives. My father was a college professor. Michael's father was a college professor. But my father, who taught German literature, was a refugee from Vienna who had fled as a child. Michael's father had grown up in Brooklyn, wore a leather bomber jacket. My dad had these very tweedy jackets. Michael's father was kind of outward. He also walked like Michael on his toes and came right at you. My father used to back away when Michael's father would talk to us. And Michael had three brothers. I was one of three brothers. I had a sister. So when my sister and I played Monopoly, we let each other buy the properties we liked. In Michael's family, it was just a Darwinian scrimmage for survival, which I loved because they were always jumping on each other. And if you didn't eat fast, there was no food. They labeled their food in the refrigerator. And so it was something I didn't get, whereas he loved coming to our house and would often sit in the garden. When I would come back from somewhere, he would be there talking to my mother when she was gardening or my sister when she was doing homework. He liked the peace.
In the world you grew up in, what kind of value was put on your intellect, on your brains?
Too much value. It was simply assumed that being smart was not just your job, but that it was somehow going to be your salvation in a way we never needed to even understand. But we both came from homes where there were many books. The expectation was that you would think your way into the future, and that we would just blast off in our own craniums, and it wasn't that you would make the world better with your intelligence. Being smart was the goal. It would set you apart. And later, of course, that notion came to haunt me, partly because Michael's brilliance was what set him apart, but it's also what allowed people to discount his illness. He himself used to say, I may be crazy, but I'm not stupid, which really meant I'm neither, in a way.
So it was the air you breathed, in a way, that focus on intelligence or the valuing of the intellect above all else. But as you reflect on it, what was that about? Where was it coming from?
I think it came from multiple directions. One of it was that we were both Jewish boys my father was an immigrant. His grandparents were immigrants, or on his father's side. And that was your portable property was your brain. And that was how you entered the meritocracy. It's the level you entered the level field by being very good at something. And that's how you would crash the gate. You didn't even have to crash it. You just had to do really well on your tests. I was dyslexic, so I was faking it. Michael had a photographic memory and read incredibly fast. But at the same time, I used to think of it as an almost a situation particular to our childhood. But I realized that in the post-war world, when Sputnik had been launched, the opening of the gates for and the adoption of the meritocracy really almost had a Cold War function. They needed people who were smart to make the world work and to make the world safe. And so it was a value not just in our homes, but it was almost how the world ordered itself. And it was being smart. I don't want to leap ahead, but to my mind, at the expense of the kind of equality that the soul bestows on you. And that became a problem, too, because to not be smart was to be not normal, but to be an outcast.
Did that mean that things were competitive between you and this dear friend?
We were very competitive. Michael was much more overtly competitive because he wasn't embarrassed about being competitive, which I envied. I was stealthily competitive. Also because we would go book shopping together. My father would take us into the city. There was a vast store, became Barnes & Noble, but at the time it was just a used bookstore, and we would just load up our carts. But Michael would start reading online to pay for the books, which were always like a quarter. I wouldn't, but I had chosen only classics because I wasn't going to read them anyway. They were tokens of future accomplishment. And so he would tell me the plots of the books he read. and I kind of got an education that way.
So, what were some of the incidents that marked your friendship as teenagers, as it changed from perhaps that easier kind of physical proximity of 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, when you were 15, 16 in high school? What stands out?
The first week of high school, I always used to say we were beaten up by a big gang of kids, but Michael got away.
Ran away.
Ran away. Not as he told it. He shook himself free and ran, which is true. It's not like if I had not immediately gone down and gotten stomped, I would have stayed and fought beside him. But it was shameful for both of us for different reasons. I was ashamed that I was so unaware of these guys who were so clearly waiting to beat us up, not because they knew us, but just because it was a slow afternoon in our very big high school. I was jealous of him for having what he would have called the street smarts. And of course, he felt, without my realizing it, ashamed that he had run. He ran and then turned and watched. I mean, I'm sure it was all over very quickly, but for me, it was a long moment. And that kind of marked an aspect of my high school time and his. We never really talked about it. And then we both wanted to be the editor-in-chief of the paper. And when we were asked by the faculty advisor of the paper, privately, he said to me, if Michael was the editor, would you stay on and help him be managing editor? I said, of course. But when he asked Michael privately, Michael said, no, I could not. I couldn't. And then he told me that as we walked home that day.
Michael told you?
He told me, and I said, well, I suggested we could work together and both be editors. And he said, no, that would be wrong. He saw himself as the person who ought to be running it. And whether that was already an early sign of his enormous self-confidence shading into a kind of grandiosity that later was stretched into something even more extreme, I don't know. But these elements kind of later figured in my reconfiguration of our friendship and of who he was and who I was, by the way.
You write in the book that madness was in the air when you and Michael were growing up in the 1970s. What do you mean?
Well, we were both born in 1963, which technically is the very end of the baby boom. As I said, we got there in time to split the bill, but we missed the feast. You know, it was the 60s. We were obsessed with the 60s. If only we could have gone to Woodstock. But later, of course, I came to discover how the people formed in that world decided to change the world according to its principles, including the mental health care system. And so it wasn't just the validation of madness as a way of, freeing your mind, let's say, but all the touchstones. The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest became a movie. It had been a novel in the 70s, and it was the hero of the movie, who's in a psychiatric hospital, is the only person there who isn't in fact mentally ill. He's just a victim of circumstances. And so we didn't know that R.D. Laing, the Scottish psychiatrist, had said that in a mad world, only psychosis is the only form of sanity. But those values were represented all the time, whether you were listening to Still Crazy After All These Years, or anything else in a way that talked about mind expansion. I mean, one of the things I learned only after the fact was already in the 50s, LSD was introduced, given to psychiatrists to distribute, and so was antipsychotic medication. And so in one hand, they had a medication that suppressed hallucinations and delusions, and in the other hand, they had a medication or a substance that induced it. And the culture immediately decided that hallucinations were mind expanding, more mind. And therefore, the people who naturally experience those things must be priests or mystics. And so how could you ever then imagine there was a state of unreality that might require an intervention? And so that was only in the 50s. By the 60s, though, it had taken on a life of its own and was just, absorbed into the culture. No one wanted to be conventional. The secret source of shame, I discovered later, writing the book, for a lot of the kids my age was if you didn't do drugs. And you wouldn't want to share that, for example.
And Artie Lang, who you mentioned, of course, had those ideas that in an insane world, the same people are the ones in the asylum. And so psychiatry itself was having a really strong anti-psychiatry moment in the 70s.
It was. And so it was turned against itself in a way, and that made it enormously difficult. And that was also the beginning of, this is a complex thing, and I won't describe it, but psychoanalysis was still loomed large. Both my parents had been in analysis. It was the language you spoke. But Freud did not treat people with psychotic disorders. Instead, he spoke of what he called the psychopathology of everyday life. If everyday life is psychopathology, then it's great if you're a psychoanalyst because you can treat the well and you could get out of those big asylums, and therefore they had sort of deinstitutionalized themselves. Everyone was suffering from a form of disorder, all on a continuum, whether it was schizophrenia or neurosis, all caused by childhood repression. And so, in a way, they dubbed the entire population ill so that they could be made well, but the people they borrowed the idea of illness from were the most intractably sick. And so that was already an inversion of, that it took me years to understand because I was so steeped in the language of psychoanalysis.
As a teenager, Michael started hanging out at the house of one of your friends from school whose parents were psychiatrists. What were things like at the Ferber house?
I was never invited to those parties, but by Michael's telling, they were where it was like the 60s in one attic. And what was extraordinary about it was that, first of all, it was a very grand house. It was really a mansion, which had been built by D.W. Griffith, the silent movie maker. There was a time when Westchester was the center of Hollywood, before there was Hollywood. And Michael called it the Gatsby House, which was perfect, really, because we wanted to be F. Scott Fitzgerald and we wanted to be Gatsby at the same time. We both wanted to be writers. There were drugs, there was talk all night, and it was owned by psychiatrists who were very instrumental in the community psychiatry movement until the father, who was a very eminent family psychiatrist, became a follower of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who sometimes called the sex guru, and went off to India. He wore orange. First he had meditated in the attic and said goodbye to his family. And at a certain point, Michael moved into that attic. But meanwhile, the Ferber house was really just kind of it was the place of Gatsby-esque parties, at least in my mind. I should just say that the book is organized as 4 houses, and the first section of the book is called The House on Maryland Road, which is either my house or Michael's house on our short street. The second house is the House of Psychiatry, because these were the people who later became responsible for Michael's care, but it was a literal house. You know, you don't want to write an allegory, and it just happened that they really, that's really where they lived, and they really became responsible for his care, ultimately.
So despite the wild times in that attic at the Ferber house, Michael got into Yale University, as did you. And so for the 9th year in a row, you headed off to the same school. Did you move in the same circles at Yale?
No, and that was another moment when the summer before college, I remember we were sitting on my family's patio, and I thought I'd finally caught up. I was the last person to get my license. Someone had lent me a very cool, I thought, 1968 Volvo, a professor from Berkeley, and 68 was the magic year. Now I could drive. It didn't have brakes, it turned out, but nevertheless, I had a car, whereas Michael had this little tiny Fiat that he used to always work on. It didn't go anywhere, but he was always fixing the engine. But he said to me suddenly, "I don't think we'll see much of each other." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "You're too slow." And we didn't see all that much of each other. And he was fast. I always felt like the tortoise to his hare, and he graduated with highest honors in 3 years. I needed every minute of my 4.
He announced to you that he'd decided to become rich, as though this was just something you could elect to do. How did he plan on making this happen?
How did he plan on me? Well, it was just the beginning of what was called management consulting, or not the very beginning, but partly the beginning, where people got paid enormous amounts of money to be able, with a tremendous amount of confidence, to persuade people who'd been in business for 20 years that they were doing it all wrong, which was made for Michael. He was recruited, he was interviewed multiple times, and the English department, half of the English department went to go work for these kinds of places. He went to work for a place called Bain. And he felt it was selling out because his father, like my father, had a kind of been socialists and often derided aspects of capitalist culture. Nevertheless, his goal was to make enough money in 10 years so that he could retire and be a writer. And so that was the 10-year plan.
So his life must have looked like it was on this upward trajectory. Were you envious?
I was envious, but I was often envious of the very things that people didn't like about him. He was arrogant, and it put people off, but I admired his ability to say he was going to do something without feeling that that would therefore doom him to a shameful failure, which was much more the way in my own home for some reason, and partly probably because I'd had learning disabilities. I never was sure if I could do it, but also it was, he even loved this movie Billy Jack, where the hero would say to some huge guy, "I'm going to take my right foot and I'm going to kick you on the left side of your face, and you're going to fall over so fast," and then he would do it, and he loved that because it was as if the resistance is futile, and that's what he was going to do.
So what were you doing while he was off making money in fancy suits?
I was in graduate school at Berkeley, California, taking a second crack at adolescence because I felt I'd missed it the first time around, and because I got a fellowship, and because I didn't have to pay off my college loans if I was still a graduate student, and because that's where the professor who gave me the car, who had driven from Berkeley to New York in it with his beautiful wife, had gone, and that's what I was doing. I went to study English literature. Then I dropped out.
Michael's plan was to give 10 years of his life to making money in this management consultancy world, but he left after only 1 year. He wanted to write fiction, and he moved back to New Rochelle. He seemed to have always been so easily brilliant at anything he turned his hand to. But what were his stories like? What was his writing like?
Well, it's interesting. The children of the psychiatrists who owned the Gatsby House, I've become friends with, especially the daughter, and they were enormously helpful to me, used to say to each other, "He can do anything he wants except write a story." But I didn't know that I thought that was true. He gave me his stories. The thing is, he left Bain after a year because he was already becoming delusional. He became intensely paranoid. He would see things. Suddenly, the secretary had fangs or bloody, clawed hands. And he was afraid that if he quit, they would kill him because they'd invested too much in him. But if he invented a job that was so important that only then would they understand why he was leaving, because it would pay him more. So he put a lot of energy into creating a second imaginary job. But I didn't know that's why he left. I thought he left to be a writer and impatient as always, he just turned his 10-year plan to a 1-year plan and was living in the attic writing stories. And he gave me his stories at one point, and they were very dark, and they were hallucinogenic almost. But Michael used to tell me stories by science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick and Ray Bradbury, and they often had that semi-hallucinated quality, partly because Philip K. Dick, whose stories are great, did actually suffer from mental illness, and occasionally refers to people as a part-time schizophrenic, which I think is how he saw himself. But I was deeply troubled by the stories, but I didn't know if that's because I admired their boldness so much, or if because there was and I didn't take myself as the touchstone as I took him, or not. So that was an aspect of it.
So you hadn't been aware about the sort of changes or developments in Michael's inner mental state until you got a phone call from your parents. And what did they tell you about Michael? Yeah,
so my parents both called, which was unusual, unless it was my birthday, which had already passed, to say that Michael was in the hospital. And that he was in a locked ward, and that he'd had a psychotic break. I didn't know what any of those things meant. My father left out the word psychotic. He just kept saying he had a break, and I thought, was he in a car accident? But only then did I understand. I called Michael's father. We had a conversation. He had never forgiven my father for my becoming editor of the newspaper. He told my father that I should resign in favor of Michael. But I called him, and it was clear something terrible had happened. I went bird watching the other day, and this is the most wonderful thing I can imagine. So, you know, I can't tell you what it is, but I know it's a bird I never saw before.
Kookaburra.
That's a kookaburra. Oh my gosh, that's what I wanted to see. I've been laughed at by a kookaburra. Oh, even here I get to, the past isn't another country, but Australia is, and I can only see it here. Okay, what
You're
was
at the
I
most
saying?
dramatic moment of this. Well, the first great dramatic moment of this story, where your friend is in a locked ward,
Yes,
and you're
and
talking
here I
to
am
his
telling
father.
jokes. There we go. Life is mysterious. So I didn't know what it meant, but I understood talking to his father that something terrible had happened. And indeed, the stories I learned was that Michael thought his own parents were Nazi replicas of his actual parents, that they had killed his actual parents and taken their place. And he had begun patrolling the house with a kitchen knife, and that he was so terrified that he felt he needed to arm himself to keep himself safe. And in the end, his mother had called the police, and he was now in a locked ward. And then I called Michael and spoke to him. I had no idea what that would be like or what it would mean. And then I went to see him. And it was a devastation because it was so clear that he had been so fully denatured by something physical. But at the same time, he was by then medicated and had at least 1 foot back in reality. But I would only add that to make it all the more powerful and strange, I was still a graduate student, and in those days, although I was studying literature, everybody had to read Foucault's Madness and Civilization and other books like it, influenced by or that ran parallel to R.D. Laing. And Foucault's idea is that madness is a social construct. It's merely something invented by the state to identify anyone who's different and to lock them away. And it took me about 30 seconds, let's say, with Michael to understand that he was not suffering from a social construct, that he was suffering from an illness, and that it was a life-changing one. And I was very afraid.
Michael spent 8 months in that locked ward and was given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And he then moved into a rundown apartment where he was living with a group of other released patients. He had no money, no real job prospects. A caseworker suggested he apply for a job as a cashier at Macy's. What did Michael do instead?
Very characteristically, he went to Yale Law School. But I would only say, and at the time, that made perfect sense to all of us, because just as your brain was going to be your rocket ship and you would get in it and fly away, it made sense that he would think his way out of his predicament, even though it was his mind that was afflicted. And because of the way he told the story, why would I work at Macy's when I can be a Yale Law student, which is also what his father said. And so I need a parenthesis here in a way to say that everything that seemed terrible to me then, I understood differently later. For example, 8 months in a locked ward seemed like a prison sentence. He was very lucky at that time to spend as long as that in a hospital where they could at least tinker with the medication that, imperfect as it was and imprecise as the methods were, could roughly approximate, a condition in which he could once again start to reclaim certain things. And so, in a way, what seemed like the worst imaginable thing, he was literally behind a locked door, was not a prison sentence, and that most people were hospitalized and released almost immediately because all the laws had changed and because there were no places to go anymore. The same thing was true with what he presented as his choice. Really, what he was told was that he needed to do something slow and small while he recovered his functioning as fully as he could. And it wasn't really a Manichaean choice between two polar opposites. And by the way, I was also quite ashamed to discover how we all just universally agreed that working at Macy's was somehow like a doom instead of a perfectly normal, ordinary thing to do to be part of the world. But we were never going to simply be part of the world. So so all of those things took a very long time to dawn on me. And when he said he was going to Yale Law School, because he'd applied before he became ill, he got in while he was in the hospital. His brother deferred them all except for Yale. And then when he was in his halfway house, he simply enrolled at Yale Law School, which took him, they didn't tell him he had to reapply. They took him because they felt that that would be the appropriate thing to do.
Was he open with his professors about his diagnosis and his time in the hospital?
He was open with his professors. He did not tell his fellow students, who all had a sense of his brilliance, but who also understood he couldn't do the work, and who very movingly took things on for him. They typed for him. They would make sure he got to class. They would help him do his work. But still, his sense of brilliance, his aura of genius, was still intact. His professors were absolutely fascinated by his illness. Talking to them later, it was quite a reckoning in a sense. They knew he couldn't do the work either, but they had clerked for the very judges who had changed the laws of institutionalization. And for them, and they were steeped in psychoanalysis also, they had no actual experience with psychosis. And so for them, this was, in a sense, just part of the fulfillment of what the work they had begun. They were wonderful activists, wonderfully active in the civil rights movement, and they had seen the rights of people who were severely ill as just an extension of that. So tearing down the walls of the asylum were like, integration. You were tearing down ghetto walls. And they never really stopped to wonder about his inner reality. And so they were fascinated and almost excited in a way by it. And it was a point of pride to accommodate him. They were ruthlessly harsh with people who seemed mediocre, who were perfectly fine. But he was included in this, in their own sense of themselves, and they were people who had crashed the gates in the earliest days of the meritocracy. They were Jewish men at this point of a certain age who had thought their way into these halls that had excluded them by being really good at the tests that got them there. And in a sense, they thought of it almost more like they'd been knighted and could knight someone else.
Michael referred to Yale Law School as America's most supportive mental health care facility, which I guess is what you're suggesting here in the terms of the support that he got from students and from professors. Was he still suffering hallucinations and delusions of the kind that had led to him being put in that psychiatric ward in the first place?
He was. And in fact, he told, this is what is so complicated about it. First of all, it was an extraordinary mental health care facility. The asylum as an idea remains essential. The places that we would call asylums had become dreadful. But Yale, here was a walled-in enclosure with green fields that was safe and that gave him time, which is also what an asylum gives you and that the modern world never gives you, or it seemed to be giving him time. But he was actively hallucinating, but he was medicated enough to be able to tell his professors about it, so they all knew the story, as he told it, that every morning when he woke up, his bed was on fire. And he would call his father, and his father would talk him through the flames. His father would say, put out one arm. Is it burning? No. How about now put the other hand in the fire? Is it hot? No. Now put your foot on the floor, even though Michael saw the floor engulfed in flames. And gradually, he would talk him out of bed. Now, every one of his professors was told this story. They told that story to each other, and they all told it to me. It could not have been the only story, but it was. Michael was a wonderful storyteller. It doesn't mean it wasn't true, but it was the story they wanted to hear. It was a father, and they were there in loco parentis, talking his son through psychosis with the power of words, which is kind of like what psychoanalysis is about, so he could function, even though sometimes he had to leave class because he thought it was on fire. And once he told the dean, I saw you this morning at the foot of my bed in flames, and I thought you were the devil. And what was amazing is that the dean's daughter was training to be a psychiatrist. I knew her. She'd gone to Yale a year behind me. At that time, she was training to be a street psychiatrist. So her patients slept under bridges. They were psychotic, and many of them declined treatment. And she said to her father, who was a very eminent professor, scholar, later a judge, Dad, you have no idea what you're talking about. And he told me the same story, almost with pride.
As well as these supportive friends that Michael had, he found a loving girlfriend, Carrie. What did she do for work?
She was a computer scientist, and she helped bring computers to underserved communities that had lousy schools. And she was very good at it. And she was hired eventually by a company that Bill Whittle started, which was to get every kid a computer and to create schools that everyone could go to that had quality, education.
So it seemed then that Michael was sort of putting his life back together in a quite astonishingly successful way. And in November 1995, the New York Times published a big article on him with a photograph of him at Yale Law School. What was the story? What was the argument made in that profile piece?
The story was a brilliant young man with schizophrenia had triumphed over his illness. That's how the dean, who got the last word in the article, put it. He has struggled with his illness and triumphed over it. It was about how, when he was applying for jobs, he wanted to be a professor of law, which is the most difficult thing to become out of law school. People would, at first he didn't get hired because he hadn't done the things you need to have done. You need to have clerked for a judge. You need to have worked for a law firm over the summer. He hadn't done those things. So then he decided in the second round, as he said, to come out and to describe himself as he did, as a flaming schizophrenic. But they would ask him if he ever became violent. And the tenor of the story, which was entirely filtered through Michael's awareness of himself and his illness, was that stigma and discrimination were the reasons he wasn't given a shot. He described being asked if he ever became violent as a hateful stereotype. And it is a hateful stereotype. The awkwardness for me reading it was that I knew he had patrolled his house with a kitchen knife, and that it wasn't so much because he was violent as because if you think your parents are Nazi simulacra of real parents, then it is logical in a way to grab a knife. And that was part of it. So and also he had stayed 2 extra years. And I never knew this at the time. He told me he had stayed 2 extra years. They created a fellowship for him because I am so brilliant, is how he described it to me, which I saw no reason to question. As I later learned, they had created a fellowship for him because they wanted to give him time, because they understood that he could not, in fact, go out and compete. And so what's so complicated, what was so confusing for me when I discovered this was that their accommodation of him wasn't something they shared with him. So for him, it was a confirmation of his brilliance, and for them, it was an act of kindness that they were bestowing on him, but he already had trouble interpreting reality, and they were widening the gulf at the very moment they thought they were narrowing it for him.
How did his life change then after the publication of that New York Times profile? What happened?
It was completely transformed. He did not get hired to be a law professor, but he got called by Hollywood, and he got called by the publishing world. And he sold his story to be a memoir to a publisher for $500,000 or $600,000, and to Ron Howard to be a movie for $1 million. And so even though his 1 and 10-year plan to become a writer had been thwarted by his illness in one more of many inversions or paradoxes, the thing that had prevented him from doing that became the very thing that enticed Hollywood and the publishing world and attracted them to him, because he was going to tell the story of overcoming his illness and sort of live up to the profile that the Times had written, which actually was the headline. The title was something like "A Brilliant Schizophrenic Encumbered by an Invisible Wheelchair," because the dean had spoken of building invisible ramps the way you would if someone were in a wheelchair. But the implication is that he was encumbered by the wheelchair, that the accommodation encumbered him, not the illness. And that confusion was unnoticed by me, among others. I just thought, oh my God, because I was writing stories too. The hair wins again. I'm ashamed to admit it because it grew out of illness, but there it is.
I guess if, as you said, the 1970s had one flew over the cuckoo's nest, by the 1990s there was this ideal of mental illness, or this kind of mental illness, as being able to be taken back as a redemption story, and he was going to be the poster boy with Leonardo DiCaprio for a while.
Leonardo DiCaprio initially. He was very young, and this was going to be the great movie, and he was very interested in fact, the guy who wrote the screenplay enticed him by getting a sound man to record horrible noises of car crashes and screams. And at the meeting, he put the headphones on Leonardo DiCaprio and said, just keep listening to this while you talk to us. And that will be the challenge you'll have as an actor, to have all of this going on. And as this screenwriter said to me, and young actors love that. They love to play characters who are overcoming something. But in the end, Brad Pitt was going to do it. And so Brad Pitt was going to play him. And it was going to be Ron Howard who directed, but then another film came along, and so the screenwriter, Chris Girolamo, who's a wonderful screenwriter, was going to get to direct it as well.
So Michael and his girlfriend Carrie moved to Hastings, a little town close to New Rochelle, with the intention for him to write his memoir. How isolated was he there? He'd gone from, as you describe, a very supportive, closed community at Yale. What was life like for Michael in Hudson?
If you made a list of all the things that would be terrible to do if you were recovering from severe illness, he fulfilled almost all of them. He was alone a lot of the time because Carrie worked in the city. He was being asked to make ordered sense of the worst thing that had ever happened to him, which continued to afflict him. And the stakes had been raised so high that he was determined to do it because the Hollywood movie was going on without him. In other words, although it was supposed to be based on his own memoir, the screenwriter wrote it anyway. They had a big file on him, which can't have been great for his paranoia. And they met with him so they could learn what he was like. And then they simply knew what they were writing. They were writing the story of a young man with terrible setbacks who ultimately triumphs. And he kept saying to me that his own written version would redeem the version that Hollywood was going to tell. He had contempt for, as he said, Splash, which was a movie I actually loved that Ron Howard made that came out when we were younger, which is about a man, Tom Hanks, who falls in love with a mermaid. It was the old dream, but it was also the desire to be the master of his own story. And he couldn't tell that story, not only because it wasn't his story, because in a sense, the Times had intuited the story that Hollywood was going to tell, and Michael was then being told his own story by Hollywood. And so it wasn't tellable, but also simply because he was not able yet to function in that way. And so it was an impossible, lonely task, and things got worse. And meanwhile, by the way, the psychiatrists who cared for him, the people from the House of Psychiatry, all thought everything that happened to him was great. They thought Yale Law School was going to be the best thing that could happen to him. They thought being in this relationship was going to be great for him. They didn't think it was necessarily great for Carrie. And they thought that the movie was going to be great for him, except for one Cassandra-like woman who was part of this network, who worked with families of people with with schizophrenia and severe psychiatric disorders, and who understood how even good things are disruptive elements in a life that needs to recapture calm and measured sense of just equilibrium.
Were you in much contact with him, Jonathan?
I was not in a great deal of contact. We did speak. We would occasionally get together. We had drifted even before he became ill. The things that had happened, the running away, the telling me I was too slow, the quitting the paper when I became the editor, as he did, somehow as I became happier and no longer measured myself either against him or with him or through him, I suddenly didn't feel connected that way. But when he became sick, I recognized how deeply we were connected in an almost sibling way. It was not about liking or disliking, or even, it was just something almost deeper than friendship. And I'd assumed our fates were entwined for so long, not even assumed, felt, known. And we both felt that, actually. And so we did talk to each other. He would call sometimes when things went terribly wrong, but he would bury the bad news. And so it took only after we got off the phone, only after he had said, I have to go now, I'm having thoughts I shouldn't have, did I later think, that was not a good thing to say. And did I even know what that meant? And the answer, of course, was that I did not.
How did you hear what happened?
Do we know what happened? Yes, you described it.
No, we don't.
We
Tell
don't.
us what
Well,
the phone call that you got.
My mother called and told me not to go home. And that was because, as she said, Michael had hurt Carrie. She didn't tell me what that meant. I wasn't sure she knew. She had heard from someone in the neighborhood who had heard from Michael's mother. And I didn't know why I shouldn't go home, but she had a fear that he would find me. And he was then missing, but then hurt Carrie was quickly updated to he had killed her. And 3 years after that New York Times profile, he was on the front page of the New York Post, the Murdoch tabloid, under a single word headline, psycho. So big that there wasn't even room for an exclamation point. It was bigger than the type we had followed the Son of Sam case. It was right after Murdoch had bought the Post, and there were these endless sensational headlines and front pages, and suddenly there he was, having killed his, as it turned out, pregnant fiancée, and fled to Cornell University, where both of us had received a fellowship when we were 16. And I knew immediately that he had, or I felt I knew, that he had fled somehow to his childhood or adolescence when his mind was his friend and not his enemy. And he was then arrested and brought back in chains, and that was then the picture the next day, also on the cover, of Michael shackled, looking indeed wild-eyed, looking like the cartoonish headlines and portraits of him.
It's been an extraordinarily shocking thing for you to hear at once so close and so distant to that story. What sort of state were you in the early days after hearing what Michael had done?
I kept waking up with the sense that I myself had done something terrible, that something terrible had both happened to me and that I had done it. And somehow some reporters had gotten hold of his address book. So I was called by Time magazine, a number of us were, and I kept saying, no, I have nothing to say. And even then I felt, like Peter, I just denying, I didn't even know him. I mean, I just said, well, I don't know, but I didn't know. I didn't know what it meant at all. I wasn't even sure I kept thinking he had been killed. And not that he had killed someone, but also maybe that I had. And I had horrific dreams. And it carried me back, not to childhood, but to just some primal moment. And I would say that was the moment I lived with for many years, not the story that I eventually told, but a need to eventually encounter something. But at the time, I felt like it was my turn to run away. And I did.
He was found unfit to stand trial and was eventually sent to a secure psychiatric facility in the Hudson Valley, which is where he's lived for the last 25 years. Yeah. Despite this connection, this long history, you didn't go and visit him for a long time. Why not?
Probably fear. Probably uncertainty. I would meet his mother occasionally. When my father died, she came to Shiva, which is the gathering afterwards, gave me his number, said, call him. Everyone's getting married. Everyone's having children. He is still there. But it took a long time. It took being the father of a 10-year-old, which is the age I was when I met him. My younger daughter was 10. And meeting a high school teacher we both had who was really a mentor to us both. I was picking my daughter up from a play date and the door opened and there he was. He used to smoke in class and he still had a pack of cigarettes and a book. He was a brilliant man. And the first thing he said was, have you seen Michael? And this was years afterwards. And he said, you should. And he said he would go with me. Turned out he didn't want to go by himself either, but he had. And so eventually I went.
What was that visit like?
Well, I had to call first and make sure that it was okay. And the social worker called me back and said, it's fine. Are you the one who was hit by the motorcycle and went flying through the air? And indeed, right before junior high school, in summer of 6th grade, I was hit by, we were all playing football, and I was hit by a motorbike, which kid was driving around and driving right at us. And I stood, because I couldn't remember if you were supposed to jump or stand, and I got hit. In Michael's memory, I had bravely taken on the motorbike, but really I was trying to get out of the way. But he somehow had been carrying this memory of me flying through the air. Anyway, he was remarkably similar and entirely different. He did not speak of killing Carrie because he didn't believe he had. At least when he was with me, he didn't. And so we talked about childhood. And he had, as always, perfect recall. He remembered the names of all 4 barbers at the hair fort where we all got our hair cut, and the name of the pizza place and what the price of pizza was. And we went to sleepaway camp together, and he remembered all of the details from sleepaway camp. And so it was, in that sense, a very moving and strange and denatured experience, because we didn't speak about the one thing that was the reason he was there, but it was everywhere implicit. And in fact, Michael always carried a stack of books with him. In 5th grade, he would keep all these books on his desk, and he would read them all simultaneously. He had permission to read during class, so he would just pick up one, start reading, and then he would pick up another, like a chain smoker, but he would pick it up in the middle. One of the books he always carried around was the book Shane, which was made into a Western called Shane, classic Western. And I told him once that I'd watched the movie Shane with my daughters, and my younger one had fallen asleep. She was so bored. And he immediately said, oh, the book is better. And he started recounting the book. And it's about a gunslinger who decides to hang up his guns, and he goes and lives with a family of homesteaders. It's in the Wild West. But eventually, these homesteaders are being harassed by cattlemen who send someone to threaten them and eventually threatens to kill them. So Shane takes down his guns again, and he kills the bad guys. And he starts riding away, and the little boy runs after him and says, Shane, come back. And as Michael put it, Shane says, Michael said to me, Shane wears a black hat like a villain, even though he's the hero. And then he says, in the book, Shane says, he can't go back because there's no going back from a killing. And originally I was going to call the book No Going Back, which is ironic because the first line of the book is, I am going back. But that paradox is very much still present, I think. But in any case, was he communicating or embodying in some way, in the language of our childhood, some embodied recognition of why he was there? It would be an error to ascribe too much meaning. He was very ill, but there he was.
What have you told him about the book that you've written?
He knew that I was writing a book about our lives, but because it would have been wrong and cruel for me to say that I was writing a book about his killing Carrie, because he didn't think he had. And also, I didn't know Carrie, the woman he killed, but Carrie is in the book, and she is in the book as fully as anyone is in the book. And her friends were enormously helpful, generous, and it was very important to me. I wasn't telling Michael's story. I was, in a sense, telling my story, or my story of what it was like to be bound up with this story. And it was necessary for her to be there, because otherwise she would have disappeared, as she did, in a sense, even when she was the victim. It was his tragedy just as it had been his triumph. And so I had broken faith in that sense already with that single story. And that was part of the complexity, and probably why it also took me so long to write the book. And also, although I say that it was called No Going Back, and it begins with a little introduction, I am going back 50 years. When I started, I am going back 40 years, and then more than 40 years. Finally, my wife said to me, it's going to be 50 when it's published, and which was a shocking astonishment, because I was older than our parents were when we met. I could have been the father of both of us by then. But I begin that way because I didn't want to tell the story looking backwards only, filtered through what one of the professors described as a tragic inevitability, but to embody it and like a novel and tell it moving forward, overshadowed by an awareness of what would come, because choices were being made all the time, and it wasn't a tragic inevitability. Large choices were being made by the culture, by the legal profession, by the psychiatric profession. They turned into policies that reinforced the culture, that led to new laws, that became bureaucracies that don't even have a mind. They just go like a doomsday machine implementing whatever their directive is. And so I felt I had to try to embody everyone, including Carrie, including our young selves. And so it was moving forward through a kind of ignorance towards something, and it wasn't just telling stories, it was untelling stories. So it's very hard to explain to somebody whose relationship to reality is itself still broken, and were he to awaken from that state, would come to terms with the fact that he had killed the person he loved most in the world, especially because I was, as I say, telling stories, but also I had to untell them because so many false stories were told. And I had just as we grew up believing being smart was all in all, we really grew up believing writers were everything. And it's not just that the victor tells the story, but that telling the story makes you a victor. But that is actually not the case.
I very much hope that you get the chance to go and see a kookaburra and a whole bunch of other birds, because what you've brought from yourself in this conversation and in the book is truly astonishing. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you all. Thank you.
And I think you'll have got a sense from that conversation, the kind of deep thinking and reckoning that goes on in this book. It is a big book, and it's fascinating on every page. So if you haven't got a copy yet, I really recommend it. And Jonathan will be signing copies over at the tent. So please go and take that opportunity if you can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Brilliantly.
I'll just do a bit of explaining about who you are. Devorah is Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Southampton in the UK. But she's also, I don't know how she does it, she's also a mother of 2 young children, and she also manages to write books as well as having a job. So, I mean, not that writing books isn't also a job. So she's written some terrific books, including Feeling Jewish, which, if you're interested at all in the subject, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And she's also a filmmaker, to add to everything else that she's also doing, with her husband, Josh Apignanesi. And both films that they've done together are basically about marriage and relationship, I would argue, but we will talk about those a bit later. And her new book, and the book that we're here to talk about today, is brilliant. It is called On Marriage. It's a beautiful hardback. At least I've got a hardback. It may be available in paperback as well. And it was the book of the year in 2023, according to both The New Yorker and Kirkus. So we're talking, it's a very, very seriously good book. And Devorah herself, the wonderful Susie Orbach, and I'm sure many of you here are old enough like me to know Fat is a Feminist Issue is one of the seminal texts of feminism. Well, Susie said this about Devorah's book: philosophically and emotionally smart. It's very funny too. Who wouldn't want to marry Devorah? So I would like you all to give her a very warm cyber welcome to Australia. Thank you. Devorah, the basic question, I guess, is to start with is, how did you come to write a book on marriage?
Well, first of all, hello and thank you. And I've also just read this remarkable book by you, so I feel a memoir of your transformation into parenthood and also touching on your own marriage. So I have this very strong sense of you now, and it's an extraordinary thing to see you there. But also I have the envy of seeing you sitting in sunlight during the day, and you're meeting my very creaturely nighttime self that's had too much coffee in it. But just to give you that, so how come I wrote a book called Marriage? Well, I think there's something tremendously. I grew up in the 19th century. You can't tell that about me, but I grew up in the late 19th century, and so I'm really very traditional. And my background, somewhat religious, but basically fairly small C conservative. I'm the kind of person who has to have proposals. Essentially, I can't propose anything for myself. So proposals have to come to me for me to do anything about them. And pretty much all my books were proposed to me by publishers. It's as though I'm just sitting waiting to be proposed to, for whatever it is. And I can see there's some problems with that from a feminist and various other perspectives. But I find proposals very kind of extraordinary, because the moment I am proposed to, extraordinary images begin to sort of appear in my mind. It's incredibly generative very, very quickly for me. Any proposal, if I like it at all or it interests me at all, I'm suddenly moved in a direction. And so the publisher at Penguin proposed this book on marriage to me. And weirdly, the setting was very much like a marriage proposal, because we were sort of in a picnic situation on the grass. and he had seen one of my films and read something I'd done. And he's also, weirdly, my husband put my wedding speech online, and he'd seen that. And for these reasons, he proposed marriage book to me. And then he saw in me somebody who was clearly very interested in marriage, and I hadn't noticed that about myself. And then the moment the proposal came, I discovered I'm obsessed with marriage. It's like completely an obsession of mine that I simply hadn't noticed. So that's how I came to write the book.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love all the metaphors about proposal and marriage in that too. And if you can actually look at Devorah's speech. It's Vimeo, I think. It's online, and it is one of the most wonderful speeches that you will come across. I wondered myself what it was doing there. So that's interesting that Josh put it there. So
Yeah, I know. What is it doing now? It's a very, yeah. I know I mean, there's a degree of exhibitionism in my marriage. I can't deny it.
Well,
Because
we'll
it's all
talk
out
about
there,
that a bit later, actually. But can you explain your thoughts on your description of marriage as a kind of ultimate cover story? At one stage, you talk about wanting to subtitle it a cover story. Can you explain a
I
bit?
say that in the book, that I wanted to subtitle it a cover story.
Yes, somewhere in the book.
It's interesting that I say that, because I guess I'm taking revenge on my publisher, who said I wasn't allowed to call it on marriage a cover story. There are a lot of reasons I see marriage as a cover story. One is just actually etymologically that the word nuptial, coming from the Latin, actually means to cover. And so it's not just, the veil. I mean, there's this extraordinary drama and exquisite drama with the veiling on marriage. The sort of sense of veiling is even there in the theatre of the wedding, of the event, the inaugural event. But we know this, right, about marriages, that in some ways they're the most, I mean, they are in a way the most sort of normative as well as pretty normal thing you can find. It's like so much part of the itinerary of how so many people imagine a life story. You grow up, sort of get married, have kids. I mean, it's often very hard for people to think of any staging points other than those sort of quite crude things. And that's going back for a very long time. And everybody knows some married people. A lot of people grew up in the homes of married people, and yet nobody seems to know what goes on inside anybody's marriage. It seems to be a place of extraordinary secrecy and privacy, even to the people who are married themselves. Yes. They don't seem to know what's going on in their marriage. And of course, one of the reasons is, let's say you're married to one other person. Well, you both have very different marriages, because you married them and they married you. So you've both got a very different marriage going on. And so even you don't have a kind of know what's going on in any kind of shared sort of sense in the marriage. And if you have parents who are married, that's the greatest mystery of all. You can never know what's going. So actually, and then I suppose there are various other ideas I had about it as a cover story, which is, one of the great things about an ostensibly very normative institution that's very respectable, that's expected of people, is the world says, oh, that's fine. If you're married, you can go behind closed doors, and then you do whatever the hell you like. So behind those closed doors, I think probably various experiments have taken place. Some of them, I mean, we know that behind those closed doors, there's also tremendous abuse has taken place. But all kinds of terrible things have happened behind those closed doors. But I think some very interesting and experimental ones have happened as well. So it's a cover story.
I love that.
Also, it's a cover story for all kinds of other reasons too.
Yes. But I love the epigram that you start with is one from Angela Carter and The Bloody Chamber, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, which is this wonderful quote, "Away into the unguessable country of marriage," which I think is beautiful and so true. Exactly, it speaks to what you're just saying. And it seems to me that ultimately your book is a work of philosophy, really, in that its examination of marriage concerns the nature of human relationships. It's a very, very profound book, as well as a funny one and an intimate one about your marriage as well. But does our unquenchable yearning for marriage reveal something essential about us? What is that yearning?
I'd say, just not everybody has an unquenchable yearning for marriage, from what I've heard. I mean, one of the things I think it is important to say about marriage is that it isn't for everyone, and it clearly isn't for everyone. Not everyone wants to do it, and many people who have done it haven't liked it and decided it's not for them.
Sorry to interrupt.
Increasingly, people are. Oh, sorry?
No, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt, but later in the week I'm doing a session with an Australian writer called Clementine Ford, whose book is about I Don't, and it's very much about that subject. So, sorry, I've interrupted your flow of thought.
Yeah, no, and of the, I mean, there's a very strong feminist tradition of rejection of marriage, and various other traditions that have rejected marriage. And I suppose I mean, so my book is not some kind of advocacy. My book is not a polemic. It's not a defense. It's not a critique. It's not an attack. It's an inquiry. As you said, it's philosophical in a lot of ways. But it's part philosophy, part memoir, part sort of cultural criticism. It's all kinds of things. But marriage is all kinds of things. And I don't think it's my job. Or I've never really thought it's anyone's job to tell everybody else what to do. And I think one thing it's worth saying about marriage is some people want it and some people don't. And that seems like that secret should get out somehow. The notion that whatever I think about marriage should be just universalized seems a little odd, no matter where you're coming from, to me. But I think it is a very strong paradigm, and I think philosophically, it's been more or less left alone, untouched. Philosophy has been very, very interested in various other things. Philosophy has not been uninterested in love, and philosophy has been very interested in death, for example. But marriage, which has been with us, we have no recorded history anywhere in the world that doesn't include marriage. No chronicles of a time before it, and we don't know of any corner of the world that doesn't have it. So it's so sort of all-encompassing that it's quite hard to think. And I think marriage, in some ways, has been sustained by a lack of reflection about it. So one of the things that's philosophically interesting about marriage is that the philosophers who have written about marriage have tended not to do it, as though when you think about it, you can no longer do it. And that's because when you think about it, it's completely mad. Like, you just say to somebody, do you want to marry me? Sure. For how long are you thinking? Oh, I'm just thinking until death. Roughly that long. What do you say? And this isn't even a member of your family. You don't know this person. They're a total stranger. They're completely outside your family. And you just say, let's link our fates, our futures, our fortunes together until death. It's such a radical proposition. And what's even more extraordinary is that sometimes that works. And for a bunch of people, that works. And so philosophically, it's quite hard to get your head around. And so I'm interested in sort of doing the philosophy of marriage in this book, because I think it's an alternative philosophy to other philosophies, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really interesting. And in fact, there's a beautiful quote that was going to be part of my next question that you just touched on, that the marriage contract is a fearsome one that commits its parties unto death. It may be one of the only things people do on point of entry not to get out of alive, which I think is quite wonderful. I mean, I think that's exactly what you say, people do it willingly. And it's so interesting. We think now that people marry for love, but historically, love really had to conquer marriage, didn't it? You've actually written about that, about the history of marriage. Can you tell us a bit about that trajectory?
Yeah, it's a funny history, because I suppose, as we know, marriage has traditionally protected various interests. And I mean, it's a patriarchal institution, so the interests of men have been very well served by marriage. It's been a very exclusive institution. Only recently has same-sex marriage been sort of legalized in various parts of the world. And it's an institution where other things like different tribes, different races haven't been permitted to go on. So it's represented a certain set of interests and entitlements, and it's traditionally served the interests of the family, of the community, of the tribe. Most social contract theory, wherever you look in the world, theories of society are very much pinned on the marriage contract. So it's very hard to find any serious study of the social contract that isn't mapped onto the marriage contract in some way, and there's feminist debates and critiques of that, because it's one of the ways in which you get social reproduction, unpaid labor, all these sorts of things going on through marriage. So when the love match first appeared, it was very radical, it was very subversive, and you see that in some of Shakespeare's plays, for example. These sort of Romeo and Juliet are radical subversives, because they want to marry for love, and they are our ideal romantic figures because because the world says no, and actually unlike sort of love, marriage requires the consent of the world for it to sort of prosper and persevere. So when the love match first appeared, it became a very radical, subversive force that seemed to threaten to sort of unravel the rest of society. That if the love match took over, then we're all doomed. Love seemed a terrible thing because it made people selfish. They weren't thinking about anybody but themselves. But then by the sort of late 18th century or early 19th century, it became indecent to marry for anything but love. At that point, the authorities have figured out how to sort of take ownership of romance, make that part of its own sort of repertoire, I guess, in various ways. So I think I joke in the book, it's not a joke, but I say at some point, you know, there was a point when if you'd fallen in love, you better make it look like a marriage of convenience.
Yes.
And now these days,
Yes.
if you want to marry for convenience, you better make it look like you're in love. So no matter what.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that aspect of the book because you're first and foremost a literary critic, so your work on Shakespeare is fascinating. But I also especially love your take on Jane Austen, in which you write that she stands for the queering of marriage. Since many might argue that she invented the contemporary marriage plot. Can you talk a bit about that? How do you see her as actually standing out as a human being and as a writer from the marriage plot, as the queering of the marriage plot, which I think is fascinating?
It's actually not that easy to talk about because it is so sort of literary critical in a way. And I'm very aided in this by a number of literary critics, particularly David Miller has some very interesting thoughts about her style and what her style. Well, one of the things that's said about Jane Austen is that she invented what we call free indirect discourse, which is that sort of strangely ironic, sort of omniscient voice where the voice of the narrator, who isn't one of the characters in the story, is a sort of omniscient narrator, but who sounds like they're sort of doing this the whole time, like putting everything between ironic. It is a truth universally acknowledged. That so we're getting always this sort of social commentary within the voice, as if. So Jane Austen is a writer. She didn't marry herself. She reinforced the marriage plot like nobody's business. The film industry has benefited from her marriage plotting in extraordinary ways. There's a lot of money to be made still out of the Jane Austen marriage plot in a quite unsubtle sense. And yet somehow her plots are plots about individuals who were hemmed in to a social world with a social script where everything is geared towards marriage, but particularly for the young women. There is no other future available to them. They have to move towards marriage. Our heroine is always a rare kind of woman who you can feel is proffering the correct lines in the correct moments and saying all the right things, but she wants another kind of interaction. She wants another kind of intercourse. And so as she tries to avoid a marriage, or as she moves towards the marriage, you can feel she wants marriage not to be more of this. She wants it to be a subversive thing. And so she wants somehow to be free and indirect, even though everything about marriage is about being unfree and directed. And so she subverts the plot she writes, Austen.
No, completely. I find that so fascinating to see it in that way. I think that's absolutely right. In talking about ways of divorcing, so to speak, the idea that marriage belongs to the right, to conservative upholders of traditional family values and everything, is there, because that's where now increasingly marriage is being forced in that direction. Marriage and the nuclear family seems to be a kind of basis of a conservative social contract. And you also write that late modernity has demanded an even more subtle grappling with the question of what constitutes a true marriage. And I think now, we've got gay marriage now, we've got all kinds of different ways to be married, and it seems like people want to expand the notion of what a marriage is. So you've got a cisgendered American writers such as Maggie Nelson, who'll talk about wanting to be married, and again talking about the nuptial contract. She says that she wanted to marry her partner, who's gender fluid, and he's a sculptor called. He uses the pronoun he, Harry Dodge, partly because she was attracted to the words of the nuptial contract that you've mentioned, which allows a couple, and this is Maggie Nelson talking, to gain, or it may be you talking, I don't know now, tell me if it's you or Maggie, to gain entry into the intimate arena of the unpronounced. Is that you or Maggie?
Yeah.
And you know,
I think that might be me, but
Okay.
I think I am interpreting her correctly. I think there is. I mean, you know, we're in a landscape where of exhausting attention to identity and attention to pronouns and attention to these very public features of ourselves, and she seems to, her take on marriage seems to be she marries Harry Dodge, and they take a sort of mischievous pleasure in the fact that even though they're a queer and trans couple, they can appear as a very conventional heterosexual family unit, and they know they offend everybody by doing that on both ends of the spectrum. Everyone is incredibly offended, and so that's the sort of public outward face of their marriage when they want it to be. Is, oh, look at us, we're doing exactly what you're meant to do, but they know that on the inside, that other things are going on. And so when I say they're sort of entering the intimate arena of the unpronounced, it's because actually inside any, I think, home, I suppose that I'm saying any home, but I don't know any other homes really than my own. But your identity dissipates very, very quickly. I mean, at the moment I've got children. I can never remember who anyone is, what their name
or who
is.
you are. Yes, I know.
I get them. I mix them up with each other. I mix myself up with them.
Yeah.
And we each take each other's positions all the time. I wind up in everybody's bed during the night. and so behind those closed doors, these very sort of respectable public identities are lost in an instant. And that's a very intimate arena.
Absolutely. One other thing that Maggie, and I know this is Maggie because it really struck me, she thinks of marriage as an infinite conversation, an endless becoming, which I thought was a beautiful way to put it, really. But do you think there's any way to wrest marriage back from being seen, you know, as a patriarchal, conservative institution? I mean, do you think the fact that people like Maggie and Harry are getting married, and there are many more gay marriages, that we'll start to think there may be new ways, radical new ways of interpreting what marriage can be? So it's going to, you know, completely smash ideas of race, class, gender, all those kinds of things. So we can actually look forward to what's going to happen to the future of marriage. At the same time, also recognising, and this is another contradiction and ambiguity which may just reflect the contradictions and ambiguities of being alive, which is increasingly more people in this world, and I think I saw the most astonishing figure the other day, that more people now live alone for the first time in human history, which is an extraordinary figure. More people live alone than in marriages or families, which is an extraordinary figure. So increasingly, there's been a turning away from marriage, leaving aside gay marriage and all this. People aren't getting married anymore. You've got issues in countries like America where you've got black, urban poor, single-parent families increasingly falling out of, you know, the social cohesion, whereas, you know, it's all the white middle-class families that are married. So you've got real chasms opening up in the whole idea of marriage. You know, how do you embrace those ambiguities? Like, you know, what do we do about that? I mean, you can't answer that, you personally, but it's an interesting time, you know, for marriage, isn't it? In many ways.
It's a really fascinating time for marriage. I mean, the history of the example you just gave of America is got a shocking history, because actually there was a period when the ideology of a marriage in America was used in a eugenics type of way. To try to stop anybody that basically wasn't white and wealthy getting married, in the hope that the race could be reproduced and kept pure, and other marriages would die out, and the progeny with them. Yeah. Then under Reagan, they brought in a different policy where they were like, well, actually, it'd be very good to get all these people married, and then we don't have to pay, and then we don't have to pay anybody, and then social welfare goes down, and so just when looking at the way marriage is described and discussed by policymakers is a horrifying thing. Actually, it's incredibly depressing. You're talking about people's private lives, and you're also talking about, as we said, a social script that's so strong. Fairy tales, the happy ever after, the belief in happiness has been so bound up in this. So I can only see it as a good thing if marriage begins to lose some of its power to be normative. So I can only see it as a good thing if marriage goes out of fashion. I see that as a good thing for the sake of people who aren't married and don't want to have their position in life pathologized, or they don't want to feel they have to justify their situation in life in relationship to marriage. And I think that still goes on. I mean, that are you single, or are you divorced? Define yourself and your status in relationship to this institution that is marriage. I think that's not great, but I think it's really not great for married people as well to be inside something that's too normative, because I've written about this and I've spoken about this before, but I sort of know this from my sort of psychoanalytic background that I know this mostly as a parent. I really noticed it as a parent, that very strong idea of what a good mother is that when you really feel you know what the ideal is, that's when abuse thrives. That's when you take out on the person that you're meant to care for and you're meant to love, all your own failings in relationship to the ideal that you have in your head. Yeah. And the same thing goes on, I think, inside marriages. So if marriage loses some of its normativity, that's good for everybody, I think. But at the same time, I think there's reason to worry if more and more people are alone. I think we need a world in which, we can see the future that's already here is one in which people really need each other. And we're going to have to find ways of reaching out to each other and not letting people be all alone.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that, with the social changes that are happening in the so-called West are now in a country like China, being mirrored in a country like China. And you're saying that, therefore, you can't kind of divorce the capitalist machine, the sort of, free market economy, from people making choices about their relationships. So in China now, fewer marriages, more people living alone, and there does seem to be a direct relationship with economics that you were just talking about, that, it would be great if governments could butt out, or even capitalism could butt out, but capitalism is never going to butt out of something they can see money in, making money in. So
what's weird is it's failing. So actually, the Communist Party in China has just brought in a policy to try to get young women in particular to marry, because one of the reasons in which young women in China are not keen on marriage right now, one of the reasons is it's too expensive to get married.
It's too expensive
to get married and to have children. It doesn't seem like like they can afford to be married and then have children. But the the reason the government particularly wants them to be married is this is the cheap labour force. They have to make these children, and so it's no longer a one-child policy. It's ideally a three-child policy now. But very often these young women were themselves the result of a one-child policy, and so they had a kind of autonomy and freedom that they can see would get lost inside marriage. So financial incentives are being offered to them by the Chinese government, and it's not working because they don't want to sign over their lives to keep a really very damaging global economic system working, and so that change that's happening there has implications everywhere.
Absolutely. On a more personal note, you've made 2 films with your husband Josh. One is actually called Husband, and you're interested very much in the notion, and in the book you mention that this is a quote, marriage is not necessarily, you're interested in marriage not necessarily as a legal contract, but as a metaphor for a certain structure of meaning and relating. And it still has a lot to tell us about how we might come to know love. You write in the book about the fact that, just so you know, that Josh is a filmmaker. These two films, they're just extraordinary pieces of work. One, it really tells the story of the birth of your first child and his decision to become a father and your joint journey into parenthood. But so he often follows around. The camera is there in very, very intimate circumstances, and it's quite challenging, I think. But it's interesting. Within the book, you talk about the notion of people ask you why you do it, and you came up with a reason, and then Josh came up with a different reason, and now you're starting to think more like Josh thinks about what you're trying to do, that maybe you're no different to any long married couple, and that you're finding ways to keep interest and intellectual stimulation and some sort of sense of moving forward or a conversation that's going to keep you talking. Can you talk a bit about those films?
Yeah, it's very, I mean, I am very surprised to find out that I'm the kind of person who films my life and puts it on screens in cinemas. I really didn't know that's who I was until I started becoming, until the evidence was before me that I am that person. And it does seem to be to do with my marriage. It seems that I married a filmmaker who is often frustrated. It's very hard to get films off the ground. They're very hard to finance, and there's a lot of frustration and angst. And when I had six fertility interventions in order to have my first child. I was much older than when I started trying to have a child, and it became an obsession of mine. I need this pregnancy. The desire to create in that way became, and my husband was playing his role in this, trying to help me, but that didn't seem to be his project. He just needed to make a film. That was what he needed to do. He desperately needed to make a film. So we both had our creative projects. I wanted a baby, he wanted a film, and it turned out we needed each other for these two creative projects. And like if he was going to give me this baby, I was going to have to give him this film. So, and then somehow I had just allowed this camera to be filming me having this, going through what turned out to be an incredibly traumatic and very difficult pregnancy. And there was a moment when he stopped filming because something had gone so wrong in the pregnancy. And I knew he couldn't say to me, but I want to keep filming, even now, when it's no longer a light, comic, fluffy thing that it started as. I knew he couldn't say that to me, and that I had to offer it to him. And so that was really a moment when I was sort of saying, I'm making this film too, and I was able to offer it to him because I understood at that point that I don't think it's a stupid analogy, a baby in a film or a baby in a book or any kind of creative, to be unable to produce something when you want to produce something, to feel you have a creative life that isn't expressing itself, is unbearable. Actually, it can drive you really crazy. And so for me to sort of say, that project you've been working on, it can't happen just when I had a twin pregnancy and one of the twins had died. And I knew that was cruel, and so somehow the filming continued, and then we nearly divorced at the end of that process. On the cutting room floor, a lot of blood was spilled, trying to get together to be able to share a narrative that we both felt was true to us. It was really hard to sort of bring our experiences together and say, this is a story we can both sort of sign up to. But it was kind of therapeutic. And then when it sort of appeared in cinemas, which I was terrified about, I felt this release. this amazing release. Like, oh, now it's got nothing to do with me anymore. Now, because I see that even though that is me going through that stuff in my intimate life, I see that I'm somehow not me the moment I'm on a screen. I'm somebody else. And so it was this odd moment where, in order for Josh to agree that this was his child, I had to agree this was my film. And then somehow that became the marriage.
That's fascinating. It really is. But also, as someone who's written 2 memoirs, people often say, "Oh, you're so brave." You know, that's the most common feeling that people say to me. You're so brave to put all this down. But I kind of feel divorced from it too. I mean, I don't feel that it's my actual life. I mean, it's something that's grown from your life, but it's something, you know, so you say there's the you on the film and then there's the you at home when you shut the door, which is kind of the way you're inside the marriage as well. And I think that's absolutely true. I thought one of the interesting things that you said in the beginning was you asked yourself why you wanted to marry, and you wondered if it was the hope that marriage might save you from having to know all the things you didn't wish to know about. And I think that I mean, again, that may be going back to the cover story, but marriage does have good and bad marriages have both show us to ourselves in very profound ways, I think. And I think a lot of you know, one of your definitions of marriage, which I thought was absolutely beautiful, was the suffering parts of each other are what we are truly married to, committed to, devoted to, as if caring for each other's bodies as they move through time is what our marriage ultimately is or means. And in that you were talking about your mother-in-law, Lisa Abignanesi. Some of you may know Lisa's work as a biographer and film critic in the UK, Lisa Abignanesi, and also she was a judge, a Booker Prize judge. She's been on many judging panels. She's a Royal Society of Literature, etc. You have the good fortune of having Lisa as your mother-in-law, and she has made this son who's very much interested and concerned with all the things that Lisa is in terms of, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living. What are we going to do with our lives? Can you talk a bit about that notion of the suffering parts of each other being what we're truly married to? Because that struck me as a twice divorced person. And I really didn't want to get divorced either times, but particularly the second time with children involved, the suffering caused by divorce is extremely traumatic. So, you know, you try not to do that, as I know you didn't want to get divorced either. But it seems to me a very truthful thing to uncover that it's really the suffering parts of each other that we're truly married to. And if you can't hack that, you know, that's the thing that you've got to embrace.
I mean, it's very, I'm not sure how much I can comment about this because because in a way I'm very ashamed of myself when I write that in the book, because I do live, my husband has a chronic pain condition, and so I'm living with somebody who's in pain a lot of the time, and I sometimes get bored of it, and also feel that it's a pain for me, and it creates more work for me, and so I move in and out of sympathy with it and with him, and so there are times when I can sort of perceive that he would like to be able to share his pain or talk about his suffering, and he's afraid to because he knows he's not going to get the kind of soft, kind attention and reception, and that I'm basically filled with resentment because I'm having to do this because of his pain and that because of his pain, and so on, and vice versa. I have my own various symptoms. Some of them are physical, a lot of them are just my personality traits, and only a saint would be generous towards me all the time. So, but don't think I'm not hallucinating that saint is out there somewhere. But then when I take a step back, I sort of see that somehow making an accommodation with specifically those parts of each other, sort of knowing that actually, I mean, the trust that you build up with somebody, they see these parts of you, even if you're not always being as kind as you could be towards them. You have been able to share them. They know they're there. They know how to be kind towards them, and they know when in a way they sort of listen out for when it really is important, actually. To sort of lay down your tools and check in on that, and somehow to be able to share those parts is an extraordinary thing. I mean, again, with somebody not even from my family, and I married somebody from another family. He didn't have to marry me, and he did. And then there's the extraordinary thing, which a marriage is. Marriage is not a commitment to the same. A marriage is commitment to difference. You marry somebody, and they will change, and they will age, and the sweetest thing I think about aging with somebody is you don't notice them aging because you see them every day pretty much. And if you haven't seen someone for 10 years and then you see them, you notice the aging. But actually you're aging together, and that sense of infancy never leaves you. So you're always children, because everything is always new. You're dealing with new things the whole time, and the body begins to do what it does, and as does the mind, and more responsibilities and more griefs and more losses enter the picture. And to come back to something you said earlier, you need a lot of privilege, I think, to be able to sustain that contract. You need a lot of things. Money is one of them, but other people, all kinds of things. I mean, when people really manage without a sort of soft landing to keep going with their marriage, I'm amazed that they must be truly great lovers and generous souls. But I don't think we should. I think it's amazing whoever manages it, but I think most of those who probably are very successful have probably got are fortunate in other ways as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it might be interesting to think about ways that marriage keeps going on. Look, this is going to be a question that you may or may not answer, and you may not be able to answer. But is it possible that the idea of marriage is a kind of way of becoming a better person? I mean, I know that sounds kind of silly, but it sometimes strikes me, and I know that you said you don't want to see a moral, you don't want to make any moral judgments about those who are married as opposed to those who aren't. But I find myself, even personally, thinking, if someone has maintained a marriage and has kind of done all that sort of laying down and trying to care for that other person, does that make them necessarily a more morally better person or ethical person than someone who hasn't? And I know that probably comes from my guilt from being a divorcee. So I'm sure there's lots of divorced people here who probably don't agree with me, but it's something that I wrestle with. I sort of think, if I was a better person, would I have been able to stay married? Oh. I mean, do you like...
Okay, so I am going to certainly disabuse you of that.
Okay. But do you know what I mean? Like,
no, to that.
Yeah, okay. But, the whole question...
What I would say is there's a horrible kind of... I think it comes from religion. It comes from... Actually, John Milton's tract on divorce was really an amazing progressive moment, actually, in the history of marriage. Because he says that a miserable marriage should be annulled. That's not a true marriage. I mean, so he's saying marriage, because it's for him, it's sacred, and therefore, if it's in God's name, it should be happy, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be happy all the time, but basically, people should feel they're happy to be in this situation, that they continue to want it, and if they don't, if they're miserable, then it should be annulled. And the notion that somehow you have to stay married and that's moral, and keep it going, that's not moral, that's abhorrent. That's a kind of in a way I take that idea even further. I mean, this is so shocking for a book that most people who read this book I think I'm sort of on the side of a certain kind of marriage. But I think I do include in it an argument which I partly get from the American philosopher Stanley Cavell, a sort of interpretation of him, that you should divorce if you can. That if you can divorce, then why can you? Because if you can, you might as well not be together. So in a way, I'm interested in the marriages that people who feel no, not for practical or material reasons, but for sort of other reasons. They can't imagine living without each other. Actually, there's something in their relationship. They need each other, and so they're going to make it work. And so then, how do they make it work?
Yes.
So I think there is, yes, something to be learned that's incredibly valuable from people who figure it out over the long term, how to still want this over the long term, to keep desire going for the marriage and for each other over the term, and which is a certain kind of idea of happiness, I think. And I suppose I am a romantic in lots of ways, and I think of love as a transformation. I think of love as two people meeting each other and letting something go about themselves, about their sort of the edifices of the structure of their egos, and being transformed, being open to change by the other. And of course, for me, all ethics inheres in that possibility that you are prepared to change over time and be changed by other people and by contact with others. And for me, also, it means you need a sense of humor, and that a really good marriage is a comedy, really.
Thank you, and thank you for absolving me from my guilt. I was going to ask some questions, but I'm not sure. Do you feel? I'm just going to ask the audience. What do you feel like? Do you feel like asking some questions? I'm happy to convey those questions to Devora if anyone has anything directly to ask her. No, we seem to have dealt with the whole notion of marriage then. So I will just finish with my last question, which I'm sure you can't answer, but I'm going to give you. You can have a go at it anyway. What is the future of marriage, Devora Bohm? What is the future of marriage?
You know, it's really. If I'm honest, I don't know. Partly because the future's not happened yet, in this country, the Office for National Statistics has just recorded for the first time more people are not married than married.
Yes.
So that's the first time that's ever happened. It's dropped to less than 50%. And so we can see a lot of people I know are trying sort of polyamorous relationships. A lot of people I know are trying alternative systems of kinship and all kinds of other ways of doing things. When I launched this book in the United States late last year, I was in conversation with, I don't know if you've got the show there, it's called Couples Therapy, or the couples therapist is called Orna Gralnick.
Yes.
And she's a remarkable woman. And I was in conversation with her, and this came up. Because she's seeing more and more people trying different kind of methods, structures. And her theory is that it has something to do with climate breakdown, the fact that, we really need to figure out different ways of approaching this future. But I also know that marriage has always come in and out of fashion. And when it's on its way out, that's nearly always a sign that it's on its way back. So when we're thinking about this very daunting future that we're all facing, the idea of people standing together, taking somebody by the hand and saying, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, for better or for worse, and we're going to weather this storm together, I think it's a very inspiring thing, because I think people really don't believe in the long term right now. They don't believe in the long term on so many fronts, and so it's really important that those Chinese women reject the marriage that's being offered to them by the government, because that marriage is being offered to them by the government in order to create cheap goods that are destroying the planet, that are destroying our long term. And whereas the real commitment of marriage is in the interests of a future that should be better. It's a happier ever after, and so it's interesting in the long term. So we have to really, be careful what kind of marriage we're being offered, and distrust some of the ones, I think, that are being promoted, particularly by governments and nations. But I think people will continue to be inspired by this sort of love story, the romantic idea of marriage that has sort of taken over our imaginations, because there's something very primal about it, two against the world and facing that world together.
Thank you very much. That's a beautiful note to end on. Would you join me in thanking Devara Baum from London? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And now we can go to bed.
I hope so.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.